the craziest cave rescue missions ever. If you're anything like me, then you guys have spent a lot of time at 2 a.m. watching YouTube. And for some reason, we all end up in the same rabbit hole, watching those insane caving videos. You know, the guys with loving families at home who just decide that they need to shove themselves through 2-inch cracks, 100 feet under the ground, while half underwater and covered in spiders. And at this point, it's even a meme to make fun of these crazy cave people. All over TikTok, people are just putting shoes over cracks and being like, oh, look at me, I'm a caver, which is honestly hilarious. But in this video, we're going deep. No pun intended. Today, we are discussing rescue missions, but I'm putting a twist on this video. These rescue missions could either be successful or unsuccessful, and you won't know the outcome until the end of the story. So buckle up and don't get too attached to the characters in these stories. Let's begin. Thunder Canyon. This story gets seriously intense and involves a software engineer who went on a cave expedition with an experienced group and ended up fighting for his life. Brent Colvin is a 39-year-old software engineer from Valley Center, California. And due to the fact that he was an engineer, he was a very meticulous planner, especially when it came to planning unique adventures. And his trip to Thunder Canyon was no different. It's important to note that Brent is not an unexperienced caver and has been caving for years and is considered by many an intermediate to advanced caver. And the group of cavers he was about to embark on this expedition on were even more experienced than him. Thunder Canyon is a legendary cave for a few reasons. For starters, it's extremely elusive and is not marked anywhere, and it's only known within the caving community. And even learning the coordinates or general location of this cave system is more or less of a privilege. That aura for a lot of cavers already is so enticing, but it doesn't end there. The cave itself is dynamic. It's deep, dark, open in some places, wet in some places, tight in some places, and it almost sounds like I'm not describing a cave, but trust me, I am. Personally, it's hard to imagine a cave seeming enticing. However, if caving is your thing, Thunder Canyon had everything you wanted. It was rare, unique, and there was also many ways to approach it, as there was multiple entrances and exits that have been mapped out by other cavers. On Sunday, May 3rd, 2010, Brian and 6 other experienced cavers found themselves en route to Thunder Canyon, which included a short drive down an abandoned dirt road, and then from there a 2-mile hike to even get close to one of the elusive entrances to Thunder Canyon. After doing some searching, they find one of the entrances at 11 a.m. and the excursion begins. Upon entering this cave, they descend, and shortly after, without a hitch, the entire team clears the first obstacle. However, after this first rappel was a much larger task. It was an 80-foot drop. Now, it's important to note that this isn't just a rappel either. This rappel is a descent into darkness, going through a literal underground waterfall that lands you into a underground puddle of almost freezing cold water. But for cavers, this is all part of the thrill. The guide, Luca, is the first to rappel, and shortly after, the other cavers rappel as well, until they are all safely at their first checkpoint. At this point, it was obvious that some of the cavers were already feeling the pressure of what this cave was about to bring, and the guide even gave everybody an out, saying it's only going to get worse from here, and if you want to get out now. There is about to be tight squeezes, it's only going to get colder, and the trip has just begun. But even with some unsure faces, everybody continued on the journey. After completing a few rooms and rappelling twice more, the group meets their first fissure, aka one of these claustrophobic holes, which was literally named the Terrible Traverse. And it's called that because it takes a right angle into a 9-inch wide crack. A gap so tight that you can't even turn your head. And not only is it tight, the gap is also deep. 200 feet deep from top to bottom. It's important to note that the group reached this fissure at 3 p.m., 4 hours into their caving journey. And this fissure was one of the last things standing in their way before they were at the exit of the planned route. And it was, of course, at this fissure where everything was going to take a terrible turn. The guide of this expedition goes through this crack first, without a hitch. He's done it many times. Next up, one of the least experienced cavers goes through this gap, and he, unfortunately, gets stuck. And not only does he get stuck, but he panics. He had never been pinned like this before and was freaking out, and none of the other cavers were going to be able to help him until he calmed down. However, within 5 minutes, the guide was able to calm him down, and within 10 minutes, the guide and the other cavers were able to pull him through and assist him out of the cave. After that slight hiccup, 3 other cavers in your party make it through this fissure, and it's at that point when the guide takes all of the other cavers out of the group, leaving Brent to cross this fissure all by himself. A reasonable decision because Brent was an experienced caver and had experience in this specific cave. However, Brent hadn't experienced the Terrible Traverse, and this experience would be one that he would never forget. It's important to note that Brent was very nervous about trying this gap, and he didn't even know that the guide had left with the other cavers. So it was simply just Brent and his final buddy behind him in the cave. Regardless, Brent began moving through the terrible traverse. One of the biggest challenges associated with this fissure is the fact that you're not just walking through a gap or crawling through a gap. You have to move feet first down the length of the crack, and then angle your body sideways to shimmy along before dropping down a 5-foot gap where you could then get your footing and squeeze through to the exit. Just to be extra cautious, Brent removed his wetsuit to ensure he had as much space as possible. However, after inserting his body fully into this fissure, he was almost instantly stuck. He could feel the tension of the rocks on his chest, his hips were wedged between the walls, and the only thing supporting his body was his hand. He couldn't move in any direction, and it was at that point when he realized he was stuck. After being stuck for what felt like an eternity, the guide returned, only to notice Brent was stuck. And after 2 hours of their best efforts, Brent was no closer to being free and was actually beginning to slip deeper and deeper down this fissure. Due to the stress of believing that he would not make it out alive, Brent became rather lucid. And the final caver behind him, James, was simply telling him stories to try to keep him awake and conscious. And it wasn't until 6:40 p.m., almost 4 hours later, that the San Bernardino Mountain Rescue Team was actually notified and mobilized to the position. After 7 hours of Brent being stuck, the guide was signaling to a rescue helicopter that was sent, as the initial rescue team that showed up was simply not equipped to help Brent. And although the helicopter spotted them and help was on the way, it took an additional 4 hours for the helicopter to find a safe place to land and the specialized team to get on site. At this point, there was a very real risk of hypothermia for Brent and compartment syndrome, which is essentially when your chest is compressed for a long period of time, exposing you to the risk of cardiac arrest. Brent dying in his stuck position was a very real situation, and was only becoming more and more likely as more time passed. Once the rescue team finally was able to reach Brent within the cave, they explained exactly how severe the situation was, and their first order of business was keeping him as warm as possible, as he had no wetsuit on and his body was trapped between two rocks that were much colder than his body temperature, essentially drawing heat out of his body. The rescuers put heat packs around Brent and even gave him an electrolyte beverage. But with Brent and the final caver, at this point hypothermic, the rescuers had to move quick to save these individuals. As the rescue team began to attempt to move Brent, it was obvious that this was going to be a painful experience, as his ribs were tightly wedged between two rocks. As they began pulling at his feet, Brent was screaming in pain, and the rescue team even asked Brent if they should stop pulling him, and it's reported that Brent literally replied, "I don't care if you break my ribs, just get me out of here." The rescuers used as much leverage as possible to lift the wooden board that bridged the gap in this fissure that was supporting Brent, and they used anchors to try to lift his body to pull him out. And with many failed attempts, they were able to move him 1, 2, 3 inches until they had him in a spot where their only option was to begin pulling his feet and essentially yanking him out of this cave. Brent's condition deteriorated deeper and deeper, and at 3:40 a.m., nearly 15 hours after entering the cave, Brent was pulled free out of the cave and rescued. After Brent was led out of the cave, the final caver quickly squeezed through the fissure without an issue, and the entire team survived this expedition. And after everything was said and done, it took over 13 people to help rescue Brent. I thought I'd start this video on a happy note. Yeah, Brent survived, fortunately. But I could not imagine what that experience would be like. And truthfully, I don't even want to paint a picture because I don't even want to imagine it. Being stuck, sideways, dark, hypothermic, and lucid has to be just awful. And believe it or not, Brent promised himself that he would continue caving after this. Although he did say he would avoid tight squeezes, so at least there's that. At least he made it. But that might not be the case for this next story. The Peruvian Intimeche Cave. Cecilio Lopez Tercero is a lifelong caver and adventure lover, and whether it be a natural talent or simply because of his lifelong experience and fascination, Cecilio had a very particular skill for navigating caves and squeezing through extremely tight gaps, seemingly with ease and almost no fear. He is a respected cave explorer, and at the time of this story, he is considered a veteran caver. Cecilio was even a member of the Madrid Rescue Group, meaning that he was more qualified than anybody, not only to save people, but also to explore caves safely. He was one of Spain's most renowned rescuers and cavers. Cecilio was Spanish, but due to his unique skills, he was taken on expeditions around the world to navigate caves that no one else would dare, and to map out caves that no one else could. I think you guys get the idea. This guy was a pro. Cecilio had heard of this obscure and rare cave system in the mountains of Peru through some of his colleagues, and when he learned that there was a potential for there to be never-before-seen artifacts or structures, he was instantly on board, and the expedition was set. And Cecilio and 9 of his colleagues began their expedition into the Intimache cave in the Peruvian Andes. The Intimache cave was reported to be at least a mile long and at least 1,200 feet deep, and Cecilio was curious how much deeper and longer it was and what secrets were hidden down in the bottom of this cave. Like any professional, Cecilio studied meticulously, learning of all of the risks associated with this cave. With the expedition underway, Cecilio led his group of colleagues into this cave on a multi-day expedition. And the first few days went on without any issues. Notes were taken, beautiful sights were seen, and everything was going to plan. But as they got deeper and deeper into the cave, the squeezes only got tighter, and the map only got more vague. After multiple days in this cave, the challenging physical aspect was obvious and accounted for, but the mental aspect was starting to take a toll as well, as these people at this point had been in complete darkness for days, only seeing the light of their headlamp. And the cave that they are hundreds of feet into is completely silent, only broken by the sounds of water dripping. It wasn't until what would have been one of the last days of the expedition that tragedy struck, and it was during a rappel portion of the cave. Cecilio was about to descend a modest 15 meters into the next room, known as the 13 days room. And it was at this point, after the anchor was set and he began rappelling, that he heard a cracking noise. His anchor had failed, and Cecilio was in a free fall, falling 15 meters onto hard rock. Cecilio somehow avoided all of the razor-sharp rocks covering the floor of this room. However, he lied there motionless, in extreme pain, and with a suspected broken back. After regaining consciousness, Cecilio came to the harsh reality of his situation. He lied helpless, deep in a cave that was already in an extremely remote and treacherous location, 400 miles away from Lima, Peru. He knew he needed to be rescued, but he also knew it was not going to be easy. One of Cecilio's colleagues carefully climbed down to where Cecilio was to assess the situation and realized how grim it was. One of the cavers in this party left to get help, and the others stayed with Cecilio to help monitor his health. Fortunately, Cecilio survived a fall that could have easily been fatal for some. However, now he has to survive what would likely be the most grueling days of his life, as after he fell and sustained these injuries, it would take almost a week for rescue personnel to make it to where Cecilio was. Keep in mind, Cecilio was in a deep, remote cave located on the top of a mountain, where the entrance of the cave was at over 10,000 feet in altitude. When this medical team finally was able to find the location of the cave, hike over 10,000 feet to the cave entrance, and then begin the wild journey to where Cecilio was in the bottom of this extremely advanced cave, they weren't even there to help him escape. They were simply there to provide comfort measures and assess his health. They built a makeshift base camp and began administering morphine to provide comfort to the injured man that the medical team didn't know if they'd be bringing out dead or alive. Because Cecilio was still alive, removing him was going to be an extremely complicated feat, and it couldn't simply drag him by his feet, and he, unable to feel his legs, was unable to help himself as well. The medical team brought a rigid stretcher that was specifically designed to help carefully drag Cecilio out without jolting or repositioning his body, risking injuring him even worse. With medical measures in place, it was up to the other cavers to request specialized help. And initially, the Spanish government was unwilling to send a rescue team, and then they turned to the Peruvian government, both of which who denied to send help to save Cecilio's life. Cecilio's colleagues did the only thing they could do. They reached out to the Madrid Caving Society and also turned to social media, begging for support to help save their dear friend's life. They did everything they could to pressure the Spanish government into saving one of their most valuable cavers. Now, this is where things get interesting. Once some of Cecilio's friends from back home caught news of this, they immediately flew to Peru to help save them themselves. That is real friendship. And by the time these amazing friends were on the scene, there was already a small village at this cave entrance, consisting of medical staff, rescuers, and volunteers. Don't forget, this cave entrance is extremely remote and over 10,000 feet in altitude. It's not an easy place to be. And once again, keep in mind that this cave is extremely advanced, and many of the volunteers and rescue personnel that were dispatched are simply not equipped for this level of cave. And it would be only more of a liability for them to even attempt to save Cecilio. By the time that this rescue mission was fully underway, there was volunteer cave experts from Spain, France, Mexico, Peru, and over 40 Peruvian fighter fighters and military personnel actively involved in the rescue of Cecilio. And yet, there was still major challenges that took place. These 40 people need to eat, drink, they need to communicate with others, meaning that all of the progress that they're able to make is delayed significantly due to their lack of supplies, only adding more and more complexity to this seemingly impossible rescue mission. With this global team of experts on site ready to help Cecilio, they began the exploration into into the cave. And once they reached Cecilio, they even explained their plan to him and got his professional insight on the escape that they had planned. And then they built a base camp 900 feet into the cave and began to set a complex series of anchor points across the entire cave so that they could essentially hoist the stretcher with Cecilio on it without him taking much more damage. On the 12th day, when they began drawing the stretcher out of the deep cave, things took a turn for the worse, as on this day, winds were higher than normal. The weather was unfavorable, and rain was adding an entirely new level of complexity into this rescue mission. Despite the heavy winds, a rescue helicopter was able to take the freshly rescued Cecilio to the nearest hospital, where he was treated, and after many months of treatment, he amazingly made a full recovery. The case of Cecilio Lopez is literally insane, and honestly a bit heartwarming to see how passionate people were about saving this man's life, likely because of all of the lives that Cecilio impacted during his time as a rescuer himself. If it wasn't for nearly 50 people from across the globe, not to mention local volunteers and villagers in the area, Cecilio would have never made it out of this cave and simply would have died. Call it luck or call it karma, Cecilio had something or somebody watching over him. Cecilio is a gangster, and the story is a clear example of how resilient the human body and mind can be. But we still have one more to discuss: the Chilean miner rescue. This rescue mission is by far the most intense we've talked about on this list, and is likely one of the most intense cave rescue missions ever conducted. As the title suggests, this rescue mission isn't of cavers who went down a deep, crazy, uncharted cave. This rescue mission is rescuing miners working in a gold and copper mine. And unfortunately, what started as a regular day in the job ended up becoming a multi-month global affair. Let me explain. On August 5th, 2010, 33 miners entered the San Jose cave in Chile. But that night, none of these miners leave that cave. The San Jose cave is over 100 years old and it stretches over 10 miles of confusing corridors. Some of these mine shafts go almost a mile deep into the ground. But for these miners, this was a normal day at work. And shortly after 2 a.m., a collapse had happened, leaving these miners trapped. The San Jose mine, which was owned by the San Esteban Mining Company, was known for its notoriously unsafe work conditions, and the company had reportedly even ignored warnings from the Chilean Safety Administration. And unfortunately, today was the day that what the Chilean government had warned about would happen. After hearing a huge rumbling noise and literally feeling the earth shake below them, these miners, unaware that they have just been trapped, decide that they should likely exit the cave to evaluate what just happened. And it's on their way out of the cave that these miners realize that there was collapse. And not only a small collapse, but a large collapse caused by a 45-story tall piece of diorite rock, blocking the only way in and out of the cave. This piece of diorite was almost 1 million tons and fell directly onto the mine shaft. Fortunately, leaving the mine wasn't the only option for these miners, as near the very bottom of the mine was a man-made room known as the refuge. And after realizing that they weren't leaving this mine, all of the miners gathered up and made their way to the refuge. The refuge is exactly how it sounds. It's an emergency shelter area. Fresh air is strategically pumped into this room from the surface, and is also stocked with emergency food and medicine. This room was meant for this exact situation, and in this case is going to be the difference between life and death. Because the mine is so massive, men working near the very bottom of the cave still at this point were completely unaware of what happened, and one of the miners had to go down to inform them what had happened and bring them back up to the refuge. These 33 miners weren't just all mining together. They were all in different parts of the cave when this happened. However, they all survived the collapse, and it didn't take long for them to all be gathered up in the safest place in the cave. Some of the miners remembered that the ventilation system that pumps fresh air into different parts of the cave is, by regulation, supposed to be large enough to carry a person, and also should have a ladder inside for situations like this. Unfortunately, after further inspection, it was discovered that these ladders were never installed, and that these air pipes were simply useless for escape. And in their opinion, they have no way of contacting the surface, and at that point, things look grim. During this collapse, there was actually one miner who was in a part of the cave that was above where the collapse was, meaning that he was able to escape. Making his way through ash and rubble, he was able to tell the site supervisors exactly what happened and begin what would end up being a multi-month-long rescue mission. Due to the remote nature of this cave and the lack of any cell service, it took over 5 hours from the collapse happening for any authorities to even be notified of the situation. Unlike the last one, the government was willing to help these people, and they sent a specialized team down the mine shaft to see exactly what was going on. The specialized team decided to take the ventilation shafts down into the mine because they are able to rappel down and do not require a ladder. Although roughly halfway down this ventilation shaft, it is made very obvious that these ventilation shafts were unstable due to the collapse and that they would not be a method of rescue. And on their way back up, some rescuers were almost lost in another smaller collapse that took place within one of the ventilation shafts. And those on the surface still don't even know if the people in the cave are alive or not. After the miners return to the refuge with grim news about the ventilation shaft, the group of miners begin to plan for the worst. And it's at that point when they begin rationing the very small amount of supplies they have, and also begin to set out a routine, as these experienced miners understand that this rescue, if at all possible, will not take days, but likely weeks or longer. While it may seem like these miners are creating their own little community underground, kind of like a fallout shelter, an entirely new city is popping up on the surface of this mine, consisting of concerned citizens, volunteers, and most importantly, family members of those stuck in the mine. After days being stuck in this mine, the miners are unsure if anybody is ever going to come save them, until a noise is heard, a faint drilling noise from above, and they realize that help is on the way, and that somebody is drilling into the mountain. The team drilling above correctly assume that the surviving miners are going to be residing in the refuge, and it's for that reason that they aim a drill from the surface directly to the refuge, and a new challenge appears, accurately setting up the drill to ensure that it reaches the refuge, because even being a percentage of a percent off on the surface, by the time they reach the depth of the refuge could be multiple feet off, meaning that they need to completely reset and re-drill once again. To ensure that this rescue mission goes as smoothly as possible, the Chilean government not only acquires the support of other larger mine rescue teams, but also contacts NASA for consultation to ensure that they are taking the best possible course of action. While a team of experts is ensuring that the drill is put in the perfect position, another group of rescuers try accessing the ventilation shafts once again to ensure that they are completely impossible to save the miners. And unfortunately, it's confirmed. And not only did they confirm that the ventilation shafts are useless, they also confirmed that the diorite rock is still moving. Meaning that not only was there a large cavern that the diorite rock fell from, creating a ton of unstable ground in the cavity that it left, but it also means that this large rock that is now blocking the path is also still unstable and moving, while only slightly. Unfortunately, the drilling isn't going much better. And at this point, the drill has bent and broken multiple times, and the rescue holes that they've started have been abandoned twice. And due to the discovery of the diorite rock moving, the primary entrance of the cave has been closed and sealed forever. Now meaning that the only way of saving these miners is by successfully digging a 2,000-foot hole that spans from the surface perfectly into the refuge without collapsing. At this point in the story, we are 14 days into these 33 men being trapped underground, and we are still only just getting started. The head of this rescue mission made an executive decision. They are not going to drill faster, but they're going to drill slower. They begin re-drilling, but turn the drill to half speed to ensure that the drill does not malfunction or break course, as accuracy in this situation is paramount. It's already been proven that trying to rush this drilling would only take longer due to all the possible and likely failures. And it's at this point when things get crazy. 17 days since the collapse, the slow drilling procedure has been semi-successful, and while the drill breaks through into something, they don't know what they had broken through to. And as they remove the drill to insert a camera to inspect where the drill ended up, they noticed that the drill had something attached to it. There was a note attached to it. A note from the miners below. They had contacted them, and to those above, this was the first confirmation that there was any living miners stuck in this cave. The letter described exactly where the drill had broken through in the mine, and also was a personal letter to members of the family from the miners, as they were still completely unsure if their fate was sealed or not. The last thing written on the note is the most important of all. It is a simple confirmation that all 33 miners are alive and well. And this brings the morale of all rescuers to an all-time high. But the job is still not over yet. Like, just think about it. Imagine 17 days ago, over 2 weeks ago, you are told that your family is dead in a mine and that your father, brother, uncle, cousin was in a gold mine that collapsed and that they are dead. And if the collapse didn't kill them, then being underground for 17 days definitely did. But then all of a sudden getting confirmation that not only your loved one, but everybody's loved one is alive in this mine. That has got to be the most intense roller coaster of emotions. Now that they have a hole that goes directly to the refuge, they drill 2 more. One for supplies and one that is intended to be used for rescue. The miners underground now have communication to the surface through a phone that was dropped down one of the supply holes. They have food, medicine, and water provided to them through one of these holes. And while things look amazing, they are still trapped underground. From day 17 till day 65, drilling continues to make a large enough hole to take people out of the refuge, and development continues on a pod that will be sent down this hole and retrieve these people. Essentially an elevator-like tube that can take one person at a time in and out of the cave. And on day 65, both of these new tools are put into place. There is a hole that is wide enough to take people in and out of the refuge, and an experimental device created by the Chilean Navy with support from NASA is ready to be tested. It's a metal tube that can be dropped and retrieved out of the cave, and it's now officially going to begin its first test run. A rescuer bravely enters this pod and descends down into the mine. Unsure if this pod will even make it down to the bottom of the mine safely, or even if it does make it safely, if it's able to go back up. However, a rescuer is required to descend with the pod to give proper instructions on how to safely use it and to give some support to those who have been underground at this point for 65 days. The first miner, who is already pre-selected by the group, enters the pod and makes his 15-minute journey up through the pod, and without a hitch, makes it to the surface successfully and safely. The first of these 33 miners to see the surface for over 2 months. Throughout the night, all 33 of these men were taken to the surface safely, where thousands of people stood by for the rescue and millions of people were watching worldwide on TV as this rescue was broadcasted globally. All of these men were deemed in good physical condition, and they were all instructed to wear sunglasses because they had been in essentially darkness for 2 months, and the sunlight could be harsh on their eyes. All of the men visited the hospital to ensure their vitals, and only 2 of them weren't instantly released. The 2 that weren't instantly released required either dental or some psychological help, both of which had those addressed successfully as well. This entire rescue mission was insane, and the fact that these men were able to survive for so long proves their mental and physical resilience. And I could not imagine the feeling of finally reaching the surface after over 2 months underground to see so many people screaming and cheering and celebrating the success of your rescue. This entire rescue mission cost over $20 million, with the majority of that money coming from private donations. The story, once again, is such a heartwarming example of communities and people coming together to save those in need. And I really wanted to highlight that element specifically in this video, because a lot of videos on these topics don't do that. They focus on the negative, which I get. And I guess if you want your little bit of negativity, here's something that'll piss you off. Investigations that took place after the rescuers were saved determined that there was no criminal charges responsible to the mining company for this collapse that happened, even though it was known for its unsafe conditions. And while that's an entirely different story for a different video, it's something to ponder on. Many of these men were giving donations and gifts from wealthy people who sympathized with their situation, but these gifts did not allow them to retire, and these men had to make a living, most of them returning to mining, believe it or not. And I knew I had to add it on this list of crazy and insane rescue missions. And I think it goes to show, with enough media attention to get enough people and the right people involved, almost anything is possible. How to escape North Korea. North Korea is an elusive country, unlike any other. And while a lot of what happens in North Korea is a secret, the cruelty, poverty, and human rights violations are definitely not hidden. North Korea is globally known for its poor treatment of its people and tyrannical dictator. However, the world seemingly just allows it. And that is a topic for a different discussion. But I mention this all to say that North Korea is not a good place. And for that reason, it's unsurprising that every single day people try to escape this country. Those people are known as defectors. The record of North Korean defectors goes all the way back to 1998, with a recorded count of 947 people escaping the country. From 1998 all the way up until 2011, we saw a rise in the amount of people that were able to escape, with a peak number of defectors of 2,914 in 2009. But after 2011, the number started to float around 1,500 and shrank all the way down to around 1,000 defectors in 2019. However, after 2019, the amount of people that were able to successfully escape plummeted. The reason for such a dramatic drop in escapees is North Korea enacted a shoot-on-sight order that essentially gave all Border Patrol the authority to shoot any person in the buffer zone surrounding North Korea who was there without permission. Escaping North Korea is scary and truly deadly, especially now more than ever. But for some living in North Korea, that risk is worth taking, and they'd rather die on the pursuit of freedom than living under the control of a dictator. Since 1998, there have been over 34,000 people in total who have been able to escape North Korea successfully. And today, I'm going to discuss some of the craziest ways that these people accomplished such a feat, starting tame and getting crazier as the list goes on. Leveraging wealth and social class. You are a high-ranking government official, specifically working with state-run businesses. You are one of the extremely rare, wealthy North Koreans, at least relatively, and you experience privileges many North Koreans could never dream of. Not only do you have a comfortable dwelling and consistent access to quality food and clean water, but you also have access to something that almost resembles freedom. You work tireless days, and sometimes even nights, and you are quite literally being worked to the bone. However, every day on your commute, you realize how grateful you are to be in the position you're in. And while you are grateful grateful for your position, you understand that even the best position in North Korea still isn't all that great. And for some time, while on business, specifically in mainland China, you've seen the difference in quality of life, and you've been slowly taking notes on how you could potentially leave your job. Your job grants you a lot of authority, and you are well connected, not only with the North Korean government, but with government officials and high-ranking businessmen in China. One night, while drinking at a bar in mainland China, half asleep, a man sits beside you. He doesn't say anything, but he hands you his card. You tell this man that you're not on business hours, and you appreciate it, but you're just looking to relax. And the man sternly looks you in the eyes and says, "I know you're North Korean, and if you ever want to start a new life, you call this number." This moment was sobering, as this man wasn't speaking to you in Mandarin. He was speaking fluent Korean. And before you could even ask another question, he got up and left. You wake up the following morning, early, hungover in this Chinese hotel. You briefly remember that crazy dream you had last night until you reach into your pocket and feel that you actually got that card and that wasn't a dream. You get in the taxi and make your way back to the airport. And on your way back to North Korea, the only thing you could think of is the offer this man gave you. You assume he had to be a defector, as no mainland Chinese person would speak such perfect Korean, specifically with a North Korean accent, and nobody would recognize the fact that you were North Korean or make you such a preposterous offer unless they were sure, likely because they were in a similar situation. You get home and you're happy to see your family. And after putting your children to bed and once again going to bed late, you sit beside your wife in bed and tell her a secret. You tell her that you met somebody in China and this person could change their lives. You explain to your wife who you met and what they offered, and you notice that your wife doesn't look enthusiastic. She looks shocked. And before you could ask your wife what she thought about the possibility of potentially starting a new life and leaving North Korea, she jumps out of bed and begins screaming. She is completely repulsed by the idea that you could potentially ever want to leave the greatest nation. And she's convinced that you must be brainwashed and that you must be reported to the government immediately. Your wife is either brainwashed or simply terrified of what could happen to her if her husband was testing her loyalty to North Korea, or if anybody happened to be listening. Regardless, your wife grabs the phone and immediately starts dialing. You grab the phone and tell her that you were kidding. You were kidding. You were only simply testing her because nobody loved North Korea more than you, and you wanted to test your wife's loyalty to North Korea to make sure your marriage was strong. This seems to calm your wife and you both go to bed. And it's at that moment when you realize that if you were to leave North Korea, you're doing it alone. Your next trip to mainland China isn't for another 6 months, but the following day at work, you convince your boss that you have unfinished business in China, and it's best for the company if you return as soon as possible. The following week, the opportunity arises, and you're back in China. You take out the card and you give it a call. You meet the man at the same bar that you're at. After your first night in China, you call the number on the card that you were given, and you're met with an automated voice message saying coordinates and a cash value. You assume that the coordinates are where you're supposed to meet someone, and you assume that cash value is the fee required for your freedom. You meet up with this man once again, and over the course of the week you're supposed to be doing business, you get a fake Korean passport, and you are given a dedicated travel guide, aka your new wife, whose sole job is to get you to the airport safely and make sure that you are able to catch a flight from mainland China to South Korea. This isn't the woman's first rodeo, and she's able to get you through security checkpoints and past suspicious Chinese government officials, as her Chinese is perfect and her story for why she is hanging out with a South Korean man checks out. You get dropped off at the airport by this mysterious woman, and when she drops you off at the airport, she says, "Never come back." You board your flight to South Korea, and your new life has begun. So yeah, this is obviously a hypothetical story, but it's an example of exactly how someone could use their wealth, connections, and status to escape North Korea. This method of escape is the most effective, the safest, and also the least common, because privileged individuals in North Korea simply are hard to come by. And the percentage of those that would even consider leaving or betraying North Korea is even smaller. However, it has been done, and it needed to be mentioned. In this story I just told, I outlined a mysterious man, and this man represents a very real person and industry that exists, known as escape brokers. And their entire business model is essentially smuggling people out of North Korea, obviously for a hefty fine. However, if you're a wealthy individual, then that is a small price to pay for your freedom and for your safety, because the other methods of escape we're going to be discussing are not nearly as plush as this. The reason why this mysterious woman, who was an employee of this smuggling company, gave you a South Korean passport was, one, because it was a perfect excuse excuse of why somebody in China would be speaking Korean, and secondly, because it raised no red flags of why a South Korean would be going to South Korea from China. If this man decided to fly from mainland China to South Korea with a North Korean passport, it is highly likely that the Chinese government would be extremely suspect of this and you would be questioned. Specifically because China has very close relations with North Korea, and also has a treaty in place where any escapees from North Korea that make it to China will be returned to North Korea by the Chinese government. So yeah, even if you are able to simply escape to China from North Korea by any means, you're definitely not free, but that's something we'll discuss later. The example I gave in the beginning focuses on businessmen or government officials who are able to essentially network with influential and powerful people and also have access to money. But there are other ways you can leverage class and status to escape, notably being high-level athletes or privileged students from these rich families who are able to both work and study abroad. In these cases, when you are out of North Korea, you can simply just not go home. And depending on where you are abroad, you can be protected, and in some cases, even given citizenship as a refugee, allowing you to start a brand new life. One more thing I want to mention is the fact that in the story I gave, this character had kids. And if you're familiar with North Korean law, then you know that the North Korean government likes to punish not only you, but also your family for your crimes. And in the instance of the story I gave initially, the reason why the man was so able to confidently leave North Korea is because he used a high-level escapee broker. And one of his services that they include in their price is faking your death. So instead of being seen as an escapee by the North Korean government, this mysterious man was able to make it look like you died doing business abroad. And for that reason, your family is spared. And while this entire situation is hypothetical, the core of these conditions is based in reality. And while this man's family was spared in this instance, that is not always the case. One of the reasons this man was even allowed to travel internationally for business is because he had a family. And to the North Korean government, that is something that they see as collateral. Because if this man has a wife and kids, he is much less likely to just defect. Because the man knows that if he defects, his family will be tortured and killed on his behalf. And for most, that is reason enough to stay. Regardless, let's move on. International labor camps. You're a skinny, single, young man living in the northern part of North Korea. You're an orphan and you work on a farm. You've been working at this farm for as long as you can remember, and the people that live at this farm are the closest thing you have to family. But as you get older, it seems the worse the treatment gets, and it seems that the more work you put in, the less that you get paid. You're a full-grown man now, but the meals you get served are still the portion size you got when you were a child. And at this point, you're almost skin and bones. You've tried begging and pleading with the owners of this farm for more food, as they are the only ones providing your meals. However, they're not budging. They tell you should be grateful for what you get. And while they're not in any better of a situation, you realize that if you stay here, you're going to die. So one night, you plan your escape. Not from North Korea, but just from this farm. Under the veil of night, you escape on a dirt road with a burlap sack on your back and the rags that you've had for your entire life. You find yourself in a small village and soon realize that your money did not go nearly as far as you thought it would. So to conserve money, you decide to steal. And while it isn't like you at all, it's life or death, and you're able to justify it. And you fill your bag with food from a stand in the city square, from the village farmer's market. Before you could even close your bag, you feel two hands on your shoulder and turn around. It's a police officer, and good news, you'll have a place to sleep tonight. Bad news, you're going to jail. You're brought into jail, booked, and because of your retaliation, the punishment that you're given is 2 years in a labor camp in Russia. After 2 cruel weeks in a holding cell, you're put on a train and sent to northern Russia, where you're going to be spending the next 2 years on a lumber mill. You arrive at this mill and realize that this camp is almost fully employed by North Korean criminals, which gives you some relief as you at least have somebody to talk to, because you were expecting Russians. And while all of the guards are heavily armed Russians, those are really the only Russians around you, as this labor camp is in an extremely remote area. On your first night in the camp, you speak to one of the other North Koreans, and he tells you that you came at the perfect time, and that him and the other men at this labor camp have been planning an escape for years. And tomorrow night was the night that they leave, and that if you were brave enough, you could come with. You had no intentions of leaving North Korea and ended up in Russia by accident, but at this point, you had nothing to lose. The cold weather was unbearable, you can't stand farm work anymore, and even dying at this point sounds better than working in a Russian labor camp. You tell the man you're in, and he says, "We'll wake you up tomorrow night." You work the next day and go to bed the next night, and like he said, in the middle of the night, this man wakes you up quietly. Similar to something you did yourself not long ago, under the veil of night, you and a small group of these North Korean prisoners set off in the middle of the night. Leaving the labor camp wasn't the hard part, as security was relatively low due to the location of this labor camp and the assumption that if anybody were to leave, they would be dead within days, as the closest civilization was multiple days away on foot. And all of these cities had police that specifically do checks for North Koreans. Walking through this frozen, barren wasteland, you ask this man, what is the plan? Where are we going? If Russian police find us, we will be sent back to North Korea. They are allies. And that's when this man reveals his master plan. Some of the criminals you are with have been in this prison for so long that they speak fluent Russian. And because of the Russian that this prisoner picked up, in the months of listening to guards, they were essentially able to map out not only where the train tracks are, but the train schedule as well. After hours of walking in the darkness, day begins to break, and you notice that your group is already smaller. 2 of the men that were in your group initially were no longer, and it's mutually assumed that they fell behind and froze to death. You and your remaining men find the train tracks, wait for the next train taking wood out of the labor camp, hop on one of the very last carts, and you are now, once again, on your way to freedom. Wow. In this hypothetical, you're in a similar situation as the first person, but obviously on a much different scale. Because you didn't even intentionally go abroad, you were just sent abroad by the government, and you had no expectations of fleeing at all. You simply accepted your fate, but you were at the right place at the right time. And fortunately, the people that you trusted had the perfect plan. Did the person in this hypothetical have ridiculous plot armor? Of course. But I figured in these fictional scenarios, obviously based on reality, it would make sense to have them at least escape at the end of the story. Because if all the stories ended with, and they were caught and killed, well, it's not really a good example of how to escape. It's how you could try to escape and then die, which is the unfortunate reality for most. But yeah, labor camps exist, and obviously they exist all over North Korea, but some of them are abroad, and they are primarily in Russia. And while nobody wants to be at a Russian labor camp, there are North Koreans who see going to a Russian labor camp as a golden opportunity to escape their country. And it's for that reason that the North Korean government is very stingy on who they send abroad. And in most cases, you're not going to be sent to an abroad labor camp. And the only reason why you in this story were even sent abroad is because you have farm experience, you've worked in cold conditions before because you lived in a northern part of North Korea, and according to your documents, you still had a living family, which is a requirement to be sent abroad. And obviously you were an orphan since birth and don't know any of your family. Legally speaking, you still had a living family, so the government assumed you had loyalty to them, which made you a much lower escapee risk. Of course, getting to Russia is similar to getting to China. You are not necessarily fully free in these countries. You're more free, but these are still countries that have close ties to North Korea. And you are at risk for being caught and being deported back to North Korea, where you'll be punished severely. And in this instance, you and the other criminals who made it to this train were taking a train that took you out of Russia and into Europe, as Europe has no allegiance to North Korea, much like the rest of the Western world. And if you're able to make it through Russia into a European country, and from there find a South Korean embassy, at that point, it's safe to say you're safe and are going to win yourself a one-way ticket to South Korea. The reason why South Korea is so desirable for North Koreans is because South Korea gives automatic citizenships to North Korean escapees, and at least the government accepts these people with open arms. Socially, there is definitely polarity on how people treat defectors, but a bit of scrutiny for being North Korean is definitely better than living in North Korea. So at this point, let's reconsider. Obviously, going north isn't ideal, because if you use the small border that borders North Korea and Russia, not only is it extremely well guarded, cold, and far from any sort of safe haven, it's only really a good option for those looking to get into a labor camp, as being sent to a labor camp allows you to cross the border safely. And now we also understand that going through China, another country that borders North Korea, is also not ideal, because that border, once again, is highly guarded. And because of the connection that China has with North Korea, you're essentially still in North Korea until you're out of China, which means that you have a long ways to travel before you can really take a breath and relax. But that leaves the natural question. What about the last country that borders North Korea? Why not escape to the country that everybody wants to go, that gives you immediate asylum and citizenship? South Korea is literally connected to North Korea. It's not freezing cold. It's a country that will accept you. And this country also has people that speak the same language as you. It seems like the perfect way to escape. And while on paper, you're definitely right, there's one major issue. You're not the only person that understands this. The North Korean government understands this quite dearly. And that's why there's a demilitarized zone that stretches the entire land border of North Korea and South Korea. And while that name seems semi-safe, it's extremely deceptive, as this border is not demilitarized at all. It is very militarized. There is so much military from both North and South Korea. There is literally hundreds of thousands of soldiers on either side of this border, and in the area in between these two countries, there is active landmines, electric fences, and watchtowers with the executive order to shoot on sight. So let's get into our third and final story to outline likely the craziest and deadliest way you could escape North Korea. Escaping by land as a regular North Korean citizen. You, like many other North Koreans, are simply sick and tired of being sick and tired, and you decide you're gonna make a run for it. You live near a remote part of the border, where there are active personnel, but it's not as heavily monitored as other places. You pack a bag and set out on foot, feeling confident that you can make this land crossing. You don't see anybody, and you figure this is gonna be a walk in the park, and after hours of walking, you realize that you don't even exactly know where the border is, and for all you know, you might already be in South Korea. You walk further and further, and finally begin to feel free. You must have at this point passed the border, until you see something in the distance. You walk closer to it and you realize that it's a sign that says active minefield. It is at this point that you realize that you are much further from the border than you thought, and you have a long ways to go. You call the sign's bluff and continue walking. And after taking a few steps and walking for 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes, you knew there was no mines and continue walking. And you're right, there was no mines, but there was snipers. Snipers that you didn't see, but they saw you. And before you can even blink, you hear a gunshot and everything goes black. Unfortunately, that is a reality for people trying to cross the land border between North and South Korea. Crossing over the water as a regular North Korean citizen. You're a young woman fed up with living in North Korea. You've been abused your whole life, and at this point, you feel that anything is better than your current existence. You studied geography in school and understand that the waters on the west coast of North Korea where you live are much more favorable than the east coast for fishermen. But if fishermen favor it, must be a reason, and the waters must be calmer, which must mean it's easier to escape. One night you head down to a local dock and brazenly steal a boat. You simply head south and plan on running into the South Korean Coast Guard. Although hours into your trip on this boat, you get caught up in a storm and you lose your motor. At this point, you're stranded at sea at the mercy of the ocean. There's essentially 3 outcomes that are possible, and I'll just go through them quickly. Option 1, you wash up on shore. You think you're in South Korea, but you're actually still in North Korea, and you're killed. The tide takes you north, and you wash up on shore in China, where you are found by police, deported to North Korea, and killed. Or, if you are extremely fortunate, you do wash up on shore in South Korea and begin a new life. Or, option 4, you lose your life at sea, either due to harsh conditions or by being caught by the North Korean Navy, which heavily patrol these waters because of people like yourself. Escaping via the land border as military personnel. The story I'm about to tell is not a fictional hypothetical like the others. The story I'm about to tell is a real story about a real individual, and is likely one of the craziest known escape stories from North Korea into South Korea. Oh Chung-sung was a high-ranking military official in North Korea who was also an industrial engineer. He had a good job and was considered good at that job, but obviously he wasn't satisfied. And one day, he met his breaking point and was willing to risk his life for his freedom. On the morning of November 13th, 2017, Sung stole a military jeep from the military base where he worked, heading directly for the demilitarized zone, the area between North and South Korea, aiming to get into South Korea and begin a new life, in a way that is regarded as likely the most dangerous way. Although Sung did have an advantage, being military personnel, he was able to be very close to the border. He had security access and a relatively comprehensive knowledge of how things worked. Although, even with all of the knowledge in the world, you need luck and likely God on your side to even make this possible. And on this morning, Sung definitely had both. Sung sped this military jeep directly at the border, crashing through fences and driving right through no man's land. And while approaching freedom and seemingly having a perfect escape, his car lost a wheel. He hit a ditch on the side of the road and was immobile, and had to continue his escape on foot. Sung was close to the border, but he did have North Korean officials tailing him closely, and they were shooting to kill. Sung officially crossed the border, although with 5 bullet holes in his body, and was able to crawl behind a small barrier where he collapsed and stayed seemingly lifeless for hours. Later that day, the South Korean military conducted a rescue operation and strategically transported him via air to a hospital and saved his life. In the hospital, it was discovered that he was shot 5 times and lost over half of his blood, and that if he did not receive this emergency surgery, he would have died there. Sung's story is extremely extremely well documented, and this entire situation was actually caught on camera due to the sheer amount of surveillance on the North and South Korean border. And Sung is definitely one of the luckiest people to ever cross the North Korean border illegally. If you are living in North Korea currently, well, truthfully, you're not watching this video. But if you're curious about how people have successfully and unsuccessfully escaped North Korea in the past, hopefully this video gave you a bit of context and did so in a way that was entertaining due to the hypothetical stories that I basically just made up, but obviously based on reality for the most part. How to get rich in every time period. Not too long ago, I made a video about what it was like to be rich in every time period, and you guys really liked that video. In that video, I talked about the experiences and the lifestyle of wealthy people in every time period, and only briefly touched on how that wealth was typically acquired. But in this video, I wanted to provide some perspective on how wealth could be made and how you could get rich in every time period. Let's get started. The Stone Age. This segment is likely going to be the most wholesome on the entire list, and that's just because the Stone Age was a simpler time. Genuinely, not many things were required to be wealthy, and the concept of being rich or wealthy didn't even exist. In the Stone Age, simply surviving was hard enough. So if you miraculously survived childbirth and somehow survived the brutality of a Stone Age childhood, you were already essentially a billionaire. And everything even remotely close to wealth had to do directly with your survivability. That meant food, shelter, water, were your livelihood, and in turn, your wealth. So now that we understand that the modern concept of wealth simply doesn't apply here, what does wealth look like in the Stone Age, and how could you acquire it? Let's start from the beginning. Like I mentioned earlier, to be wealthy, you first need to be alive. And that means the basis of our wealth will be our life. And as a baby, our life is in the hands of our parents. So the original rich babies or boss babies or Nepo babies were simply kids that were lucky enough to have parents that didn't die during childbirth or didn't accidentally kill them or allow them to be killed in their likely harsh environment. Already, this is making me realize how much we take for granted. Next up, assuming your parents care about you, survived childbirth, don't plan on killing you, and are healthy, fit, and able to provide for you properly, you will be able to experience childhood the Stone Age way, which is basically just Minecraft, but not a game, just a reality. Now, assuming you survived your entire childhood and adolescence, you are now an adult in the Stone Age on your own, looking to build wealth for yourself. And by that, I mean literally just survive. I'm really stressing this point because it is extremely important to consider that simply surviving up until this point is a major achievement and basically the equivalent of being handed a $100 million trust fund as soon as you turn 18. But now in this hypothetical scenario, when you are alive, healthy, and on your own, what do you do next? Unfortunately, there is no online business or jobs, and if you want something, you have to go get it. Literally. The first thing you would need to get is food, which is the first and likely primary pillar of wealth in the Stone Age, a steady supply of food. Being on land that was fertile, not only for yourself but for animals, directly impacted your likelihood of survival, and therefore your wealth. If you lived in the right biome, nature would provide for you, as long as you were a semi-skilled hunter and in tune with your environment. However, the wrong biome would leave you starved and dehydrated in only a matter of days. This directly ties into the next pillar of wealth, which I'll combine two separate parts into one: location and shelter. Of course, food is essential for life and, in this case, wealth. But like we discussed, to have this steady source of food, you must have a conducive environment, which in itself is a form of wealth. But I kind of already made that point, so without repeating myself, let's discuss the second part of this: shelter. Depending on what part of the Stone Age we're talking about, because it does go pretty far back, a lot of shelters were more or less natural, with the most common being a cave, hence the term caveman. If you wanted to be rich, and I mean ultra rich, you lived on land that provided you food and also had shelter that was ready for you to move right in. Consider this prime real estate. This is the prehistoric equivalent of moving into a condo that has a restaurant on the main floor. It's everything you need all in one place. Well, almost everything. We're still missing an essential component, which is the third pillar, that being water. You now have your prime real estate. You have your cave. You have your wild berries growing outside your cave apartment, and you have a steady flow of cute critters that you stomp on and eat on a daily basis. But the last thing to make you a true bajillionaire is to have a steady stream of fresh water, ideally trickling right through a stream right outside of your cave. Without water, shelter and food is almost useless because you won't be around long to enjoy it. So this supply of water is the perfect trifecta for your life and, in this case, your wealth. But it's a bit boring if we end there. What's wealth without a bit of legacy? And maybe someone to share it with. Just because living was hard enough in the Stone Age doesn't mean that there wasn't additional luxuries you could indulge in. And for this example, let's pick our bonuses. I have my cave, I have my food, I have my water. What am I missing? I'd say a cave woman to spend my days with and unga bunga with at night. And with your partner by your side, you're now able to continue your legacy, have Caveman Jr., and ideally allow them to inherit your success. And by that I mean your cave doesn't get raided, the stream doesn't dry up, and the animals don't migrate elsewhere. And spoiler alert, those are all going to happen. And all of your hard work is basically basically null and void, because everything that you had to go through to build your wealth and literally survive is going to have to be done entirely from scratch once again by your children. I think I've made it crystal clear that wealth in the Stone Age is simply being alive. So to answer the question, how do you get rich in the Stone Age? You just don't die. The Bronze Age. No, not the guy that plays for the Lakers, the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is really a landmark in terms of human development, and as we'll see in this segment, there are many changes between humans and wealth in the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. For starters, the Bronze Age is a much more concentrated timeline. The Stone Age, for example, literally goes on for millions of years, whereas the Bronze Age is roughly 2,000 years in total. Don't allow this relatively short timeline to fool you. The amount of development that took place during this era was rapid and impactful. Some major differences right off the bat between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age is that people began to settle. In the Stone Age, a lot of people were nomadic, similar to animals, going where the resources were, as typically ideal locations didn't last very long. But with the introduction of agriculture and other advanced survival techniques, people were able to settle in locations that were deemed ideal. One major difference between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age that was spawned out of settlements were possessions. Because when you are nomadic, you're not able to carry much with you, and for that reason, you didn't own much. On the contrary, when you have a place to call your own, you're able to start collecting a thing or two. And from that, begin to store value and ultimately accumulate wealth. Besides this, we are seeing early coinage, and with this, early commerce as well, which will serve as the foundation for how we measure wealth for the rest of the video. With developed skills, new tools, larger settlements, and early coinage, it's not hard to believe that trade was essentially inevitable. What did they trade, you may ask? Well, everything, but most importantly, bronze. And although settlements and trade are developing, it doesn't necessarily mean that life was all of a sudden easy at this point. Life was still difficult, and every skill and piece of luck required to survive in the Stone Age is still required now. But for the sake of this video, we're gonna assume this is more or less of a given, so we can focus on the specifics of what made you rich in the Bronze Age. Like we mentioned in the last video, during the Bronze Age, wealth began to be associated with the control and production of bronze, which is a valuable metal that is made from copper and tin. Being rich meant you had access to metal ores and the knowledge required to craft tools, weapons, and ornaments, which were things that everybody needed. Maybe not the ornaments, but tools and weapons definitely. Like I mentioned, with settlements growing, trade became more prominent, both inside of settlements and also between settlements via established trade routes. And if you are someone who was able to take advantage of these trade routes, you could significantly enhance your wealth. Besides commerce, another way to gain money and power was through social status, which started to become more of an important thing during this time period. During this time, chiefs and leaders would amass their wealth through the people that they ruled, whether they had full control over the tribe's resources or they simply took contributions from each of their people. Now that we have a bit more context on the Bronze Age and what exactly wealth looked like in the Bronze Age, how could you get rich? For the sake of simplicity, let's assume that you had a great upbringing. Your parents were alive and you survived, and now you're 18 years old looking to build your life and become wealthy in the Bronze Age. Like I mentioned, you ultimately have two primary options. One is to become a merchant, or two, become a leader. We'll touch on both of these. Starting with becoming a merchant, the control and manufacturing of copper was a booming industry. So if I were planning to get rich, I would definitely start there. The first thing I would do is start looking for copper. I would make my wood and maybe even stone pickaxe and get straight to the mines, looking for any copper deposits I could find. Now, this isn't obviously the only way you could gain wealth. I think a better way to gain wealth in the Bronze Age is to become an artisan, specifically making the best type of either tool, weapon, or ornament. For this example, let's say that we want to make the best sword possible. In this case, I would go to a blacksmith and immediately beg them for their knowledge. I don't care if I was unpaid. I don't care if I was like SpongeBob at the Krusty Krab and I had to pay to work there. I would be getting my hours in at the blacksmith so I could hone in my skills on making the best swords possible. Why would I do that? Well, if I could make the best swords and gain a reputation as the guy who makes the best swords, which would hopefully be my official title, I would hope to potentially make a name for myself and ideally catch the attention of the powers that be. Because you know who needs swords? The troops. And you know who wants their troops to win battles? Leaders. And you know who has all of the money? Also leaders. For the most part. I think you see where I'm going here. That's just one example, but if you were doing anything valuable related to copper, chances are you were able to make a few shillings for yourself. But let's just say for this example, you weren't very inclined to mine or craft. And in that example, I would recommend you go the route of leadership. How would I go about that? I would first identify the powers at be. You could try to assassinate him and hopefully fill the power vacuum, but I think that the likelihood of that working out are low. This would definitely be a slow grind, but if you're willing to put in the time and you're charismatic enough, I think it could work. I would get as close as possible as I could to the leader, maybe potentially offering to be some sort of servant. At this point, I would do my absolute best to gain their trust, gain their respect, and ideally become someone that they consider to be a friend. Through this relationship, I would prove that my ideas were worthy and that I potentially had the skills to be a leader, without ever, of course, showing up the leader himself. At this point, over time, I would wait for opportunities to arise where I could potentially fill voids where leadership was needed or ideas were required. And hopefully, through my connection to the actual leader, I could become a person of power myself and benefiting from that sweet, sweet Bronze Age nepotism. Now, in reality, were people in the Bronze Age really so entrepreneurial focused or status focused that they'd be willing to cozy up to the king? I think potentially. And people like this definitely existed, but they weren't the norm. Most people were just trying to exist, and serfdom was basically hard labor all day to feed yourself and your family and potentially make a few dollars on the side, or simply to do your duties for the village that you lived in to make sure that you had the protection that they'd offered you. So to answer the question of how do you get rich in the Bronze Age, I'd say your best bet is to get involved in the bronze industry in any way that you think you would excel the most. In my example, I wanted to master blacksmithing swords and use this to my advantage to essentially get government contracts, or at the very least, sell desirable artisan swords to rich merchants and political leaders, and ultimately get that bag. The Iron Age. What a time to be alive. During the Bronze Age, we experienced more development in 2,000 years than we did during the over 3 million years of human existence in the Stone Age. Due to this exponential growth, you would likely assume that this trend continued into the Iron Age, but that's not exactly the case. Like we mentioned in the previous video, the end of the Bronze Age was a rather rough time, and due to major situations that happened, which are honestly worthy of their own video, most of the world was left in a place where production, trade routes, literacy, and overall progress were either diminished or reduced, making the Bronze Age more or less of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of situation. That being said, it's not all doom and gloom because we're humans and we're chads, and we ultimately figured it out. Obviously, just look at us now. But that leads us to the beginning of the Iron Age. We needed to rebuild, and we needed to do it now. The beginning of the Iron Age was very similar to the beginning of the Bronze Age, with the primary difference, of course, being the metal at play, which, you guessed it, was iron. Iron wasn't necessarily a stronger material, but it was more readily available and it was easier to produce, which helped facilitate a lot of progress. Which is why, if you're paying attention to the dates, you'll notice that the Iron Age was also much shorter than the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age was much, much, much shorter than the Stone Age. The exponential growth is still continuing even after the bump in the road. Now, that's a nice underdog story and all, but how do we get rich? Like I mentioned in the last video, being rich in the Iron Age was not very different than being rich in the Bronze Age. And I hate to break it to you, getting rich in the Iron Age also wasn't very different than getting rich in the Bronze Age. But I'll still give you a new hypothetical in this new time period. Let's assume that once again, you're a healthy, able-bodied 18-year-old ready to start your life. The artisan sword company that your parents had founded has now gone Bronze Age bankrupt and they are dead. For the sake of the story, they just died too. They went broke and died. So now you're here, alone, looking to get that bag in the Iron Age. What do? Once again, you have 2 options. Get involved in emerging industries, in this case, the production of iron, or try to get as cozy as possible with the powers that be, which at this point in time isn't an easy task. So in this case, I'm becoming an iron mogul. With establishments growing and jobs becoming more or less of a thing, my plan is to find and own the best iron deposit my settlement and likely other settlements have ever seen. But here's the thing, if I'm just one guy looking around for iron deposits, I may not be that successful, and I may miss things. And even once I do find it, there's a lot of work to be done there. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'll need help. First thing I'll do is go to the nearest farm. I'm gonna try to round up as many farmers that I can find who are no longer interested in farming and looking for a better opportunity. At this point, everyone's been seeing the new and shiny iron tools and they know that they're expensive. And likely they're interested and want their own. And my proposal to them would be, join my team, help me find an iron deposit, let's mine it together, and with you, I will share the rewards. Realistically, the proposal is no money up front, but a lot of money down the line if you're willing to work with me. And once I have a good group of guys, we're ready to go. Day 1, we're looking, searching, scoundering, floundering, sleuthing, anything we can do to find iron deposits. Once this has been achieved, we begin the hard work, mining. We gather as much as we can and determine how good this vein of iron really is. And if we see potential, we set up camp. Once we begin mining, we begin either collaborating with an existing manufacturing facility or we build our own to be able to turn the raw materials into a usable iron to make tools, weapons, and once again, ornaments. Once we get a more refined process, we then begin to stockpile and finally sell our refined material. We could sell the raw material, but we also know that if we sell a more refined material, we can get more money. And from that point, we begin begin our journey. All of the men that were mining are now selling. Door to door, potentially. We are going to every blacksmith and offering them the best iron in the best condition with minimal work on their end. Just heat it and forge it. What more could you want? Ideally, once again, the leaders at B take notice and want to buy my iron, but I'm happy if even just the blacksmiths prefer mine. At this point, we begin to collect money and it's a beautiful system. In the Bronze Age, I wanted to make the swords, and in the Iron Age, I was the person selling the materials to those artisans. Is this a realistic plan? I highly doubt it. This oversimplified, trust me bro hypothetical is leaving out so many components. Specifically, all of the violence that would have potentially taken place either between my team, between settlements, between people in my settlement that wanted my iron deposits, and so many other things that could have potentially existed. I'm just now realizing that this video is basically what it was like to be an entrepreneur in every time period, which I guess makes sense because entrepreneurship and wealth typically go hand in hand. The medieval era. Now things are really heating up and we are in full swing of development. People are settled and civilization is making major strides. There is a very established class system and money is more important than ever. The richest people in the medieval era were the people that were closest to the powers that be, those being the nobility and the merchants that were able to sell products over very long distances. Both of these were extremely useful to the king and therefore paid very nicely. And considering the major wealth gap in the huge centralization of money and power, your best bet was to get money from the king, because most other people just didn't have it. During this time, spices, precious metals, and silk were extremely desirable materials, and I'm going to use those to my advantage once we get to the hypothetical. For my plan to get rich in the medieval era, I want to do something different. I'm done being an entrepreneur. I want to now become a criminal. And for this reason, I'll need to target merchants. You see, the nobility had most of their wealth come from the land that they owned, which was given to them from the monarch. And it's rather hard to steal land, at least not without a fight. So I think I'm better off stealing from the long distance merchants. In this time period, I am more motivated than ever to get my bag up because we are starting to see the early equivalent of modern luxuries. Large, beautiful castles, servants, comfy clothes, something that kind of resembles a toilet, concubines, jewel-encrusted stuff, and other fun stuff like that. So yeah, let's get rich. Although my plan may seem simple, with nations developing and with power becoming centralized, I am at greater risk than ever of being reprimanded for the crimes I'm about to commit. Because now there is rule, there is order, and I need to be very careful about how I go about breaking it. I'll start my journey once again like every other journey as an 18-year-old looking to build my life. Let's say that I was born into an established kingdom, into a regular poor family. My goal is to become a known member of society and a positive one at that. I want to be active in the church, helping those in need, and seen often within the community. But this will work in my favor for my malicious intention. My goal is to gain the trust specifically of the rich merchants doing long distance trade, because they 1, have the most money, and 2, are the most vulnerable. See, being a thief, I could try to pickpocket around my city, but eventually it's gonna catch up to me. And honestly, there's a cap to how much money I can make. Back to my trust with the merchants. My goal is for them to feel comfortable sharing their information with me, specifically when trade shipments are going out, what the shipments are, and where they are going to be. For example, imagine I just go around the city with a broom every so often, just out of my goodwill, but I always somehow happen to broom where the rich merchants are. This isn't by accident. I want to overhear them, and ideally, I want to gain information. If I'm sweeping right beside 2 rich merchants having a discussion outside and I overhear one of them telling the other one that they had a large shipment of spices just get delivered and they are currently days away from getting their large payment, I'm going to inquire. I may ask this merchant how the shipment went and where they shipped it and where they even got the spices. I'm going to pretend like I'm interested in the business, when in reality, I just want to know when's that money coming into town and what route is it going to take. Let's just assume that this merchant slips up and he accidentally tells me that his people always come in the back route to the kingdom and they always head home under the veil of night. At that point, I have all of the information I need. I will go about my day, and as soon as the sun starts to set, I will put on my dark cloak and begin my journey. I will begin my trek on the back trail, getting outside of the kingdom and closer to my reward. I'll likely go 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40 kilometers on the trail. Something far enough from my kingdom so nobody knows what's going on, but still not too far that I can't do it in one night. I have 2 options. I can either hide and sneak attack these people on the way back, or I could gain their attention in other ways. For this example, my strategy is tricking the merchants into stopping and thinking that I need help. I brought a second robe with me and I folded it in a way that made it look like it was a swaddled baby. I'm going to be sitting in the middle of the trail holding my baby, rocking back and forth, hysterically waiting for them. Once they arrive, I'm going to beg them for their help and tell them that they need to help save my baby. I am going to be inconsolable and overwhelming to them. They're going to want to leave me immediately immediately. And fortunately, I don't need much time to distract them. Because the merchant didn't tell me who was carrying the gold and where it was held, pickpocketing here is useless, and my only option is to kill them. Because I have the agility and sword skills of an absolute ninja, I flawlessly cut them all in half and they die instantly. And with my expertly placed slices, the bag of gold and silver instantly reveals itself to me. I grab the loot, leave the men, and head back into my kingdom. I arrive the same night I left, I put my robe away, and in the morning, I start the nice side of my double life. Here's the problem with this situation. If money's going missing all the time, and I, a poor person, all of a sudden becomes rich, people are gonna ask questions. So I can't really spend my money, but that's okay. Because once I'm satisfied with the amount of money I have, I can leave my settlement and begin a new life. If I can travel far enough and go to places where I've never been heard of, which is likely the case if I'm just a locally known, gentle, poor person, in any new settlement I go to, I can tell them a rather convincing story that I am a wealthy merchant who was ran out of town by a bad gang and I'm just looking to have a peaceful life somewhere nice. Is this a likely or potentially even realistic situation? I highly doubt it, once again, but I think it's an actually pretty funny hypothetical of one way a rather evil person could get rich in the medieval era. And honestly, I would bet money that something like this happened at least once, and was probably more common than we think. Violence was common, robbery was everywhere, law only really existed inside of castle walls, and people were brutal. So to answer your question, how do you get rich in the medieval era? Well, there's plenty of ways, but if you're not born into money and you're not willing to put in the effort to become a successful merchant, I'd say your best bet is to go all Assassin's Creed and become the best thief you can absolutely be. The early modern era. At this point, we've gone through millions of years of history, and the early modern era is our last stop before the modern day. And the early modern era, although relatively short, is one of the most influential eras of all time, and is where we see the foundation set for the modern world that we live in today, in good ways and bad ways too. In the early modern era, wealth was driven by exploration, trade, and colonization. Nations and individuals who invested in voyages reaped enormous profits from new trade routes and new resources. Merchants are richer than ever, and now the early versions of bankers are also accumulating wealth through the emerging global trade. Like almost every other time period, owning land and engaging in agriculture is still extremely important. But with the continued growth of commerce, finance, and manufacturing, more and more opportunities are beginning to present themselves to, once again, get that bag. So we're in the early modern era. How are we gonna get rich? Well, we have two new options, exploration and colonization. And for the sake of my reputation, let's go with exploration. My goal as an explorer is going to be to build the absolute best team of cartographers, navigators, researchers, and writers, so I can not only establish new trade routes, but also make extra money by developing maps and documenting what I'm seeing on my journeys. Because during this point in time, a lot of the world was unmapped and undiscovered, at least to some people. I guess my first step would be to beg the king for a boat and a small loan. This won't be easy, but I'll tell him that I have the best cartographers, the best writers, the best captains, and the best people on my team to make sure that our voyages not only find new lands, but bring back artifacts, establish trade routes with the people that are there, if any, and that the places that we go are documented not only in map form, but in the written word. And if that doesn't convince the king for him to fund my journey, I don't know what will. So in this case, assuming he does, I now have a boat and a small loan of money. But there's one problem. All of those people that I told the king I had on my team, I don't have on my team. And I don't even have a team. So now I gotta get them. And during this time period, where do you think the best and the brightest would be? Do you think they would be the guy sitting on the side of the road drinking wine and ale? Likely not. They're likely in the government where I just got the boat and the loan. Now, of course, I can't ask the king for these people because then he'll know I'm lying. So I have to be a bit more creative. What I'm going to do is I'm going to identify the key players in the government, specifically for captains and cartographers, and I'm gonna go to them and tell them, hey, the king gave me a loan, a boat, and he told me that you have to come with me. Now, of course, he could verify this with the king, unless I told him a reason not to. I'm gonna tell these people that the king is mad at them. And I don't know why, but the king said that if he saw them again, he was going to have them executed. And for that reason, these people should come on this adventure with me. Not only to get out of the king's sight for a bit, but also to get back in the king's good graces. This may seem manipulative, and you're 100% right, but it's also, in this situation, my only option. And now, my house of cards is finally complete, and together, we set sail. On this boat, I am more or less useless, so I am trusting the captain and the cartographer with this entire operation, essentially. Fortunately, a lot of areas are simply unmapped, so I just tell the cartographer to tell the captain to go where we haven't gone before, at least where we don't have recorded evidence of going. And from that point, we're off. Even at this point in the story, we've done so much and risked so much just to even get here, and we haven't even made $1 yet, and we are still relatively poor. We have a loaned out ship, a team of people that we're deceiving, and debt to the government in the form of the loan. And if we're unable to find anything of substance, we're cooked. And my elaborate ruse is over. But because everything has kind of perfectly fallen into place in this story, let's continue that trend. And let's say on our first voyage, we discover the most amazing thing ever. What is it, you may ask? It's a remote, abandoned island where the richest pirate gangs hid all of their most valuable loot, including coins, artifacts, booty, and slightly used peg legs. At this point, I need to come clean. I tell the guys, hey, you guys are all being lied to, and if you don't continue the lie with me, then we're all gonna die. The men agree, we get the loot, we go back home, and we do it again and again. And we all live happily ever after. That's just one hypothetical about how you could use exploration to your advantage to get rich in the early modern era. And in case you wanted to learn about how to use colonization to get rich, well, just read a history book. The Modern Era. Wow, guys, can't you believe it? I've been able to cover millions of years of history, and somehow I've made no mistakes and left out no information. Everything I've said has been completely accurate and not totally oversimplified, glossed over, uninformed, and almost entirely hypothetical. That's crazy. But now, here we are in the modern day. A time period you may be familiar with. I don't think I need to explain too much about what being rich in the present day looks like, but I'll give a quick example. If you want a negative example, I recommend going to our channel and watching this video about rich weirdos. But if you want some positive examples, rich people just like cool stuff. Big houses, big boats, fast cars. And if you're really rich, space travel and goth girlfriends. Now, getting into how you can get rich in the present day, the opportunities are honestly endless. If you're currently watching this looking for a way to get rich, I'm gonna give you a foolproof plan to make more money than you could ever even imagine. The first thing you're going to want to do is grow your hair. Get it as long as possible. The next step is to grow facial hair and get tattoos. This will come in handy. After this, you need to establish a wardrobe of white t-shirts and basketball shorts. And once you have the look, you can begin the work. I need you to every single day begin posting on YouTube. Talk about stuff. Talk about stuff you like. Talk about stuff you don't like. Talk about that time you were almost in a movie. Talk about anything. Over time, people are going to respect you, idolize you, love you, and ultimately need your opinion for just about anything. And people are gonna eat this up. And advertisers are gonna wanna sponsor you and put their ads on your video, making you rich. Oh, and now that you have the system of getting rich and the look, you're probably gonna need a name. How about Dry Ineffective or Polar Bear 1? Something along those lines. You guys pick. But in case that's not replicatable for you guys, here's another great idea on how to get rich in the present day. Step 1 is be born into a family where your parents see you more as an opportunity to make money than their flesh and blood. At that point, have parents that create a toy channel based around you. After a few videos of you opening toys that you're excited about, your parents will begin raking in the money. And as you grow up, you'll be like, I had a weird childhood, but my parents are rich. And I think I have money, maybe. And later down the line, we'll see what happens. So yeah, 2 extremely replicatable and honestly foolproof plans on how to get rich in the present day. Serial killers from every state in the United States of America. Alabama. Thomas Whisenant. Thomas Warren Whisenant was born and committed his crimes in Alabama. He was born on January 29th, 1947, and was convicted for the murders of 3 women between 1976 and 1977. He abducted, assaulted, and murdered these victims and then mutilated their bodies. Whisenant was arrested in 1977 after being caught in the act of disposing of a victim's body. He was convicted and then sentenced to death in 1978. And despite multiple attempts to appeal this decision, he was executed via lethal injection on May 27th, 2010. Gruesome start to this video, and it doesn't get much better. Also, it's just wild to me that someone could be on death row for 32 years. Moving on. Alaska. Robert Hansen. Robert Christian Bose Hansen was born on February 15th, 1939 in Iowa, but later moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he lived a life of crime. Hansen was also known as the Butcher Baker for reasons we'll get into, and this individual was seriously twisted. He was an active serial killer in Alaska from 1972 to 1983, a total of 11 years. And unfortunately, in that time, assaulted and murdered 17 women. Or I should say, at least 17 murders and assaults. It is alleged that he has up to 37 kills and up to over 31 assaults as well. One of his methods of killing these women would be abducting them and then releasing them into the wilderness, where he would then hunt them for sport using guns and even hunting knives, which obviously plays in the name of the Butcher Baker. And the baker part comes from the fact that he actually owned a successful bakery. Hansen was caught after all of these years when one of his victims who got away led police directly to him. Once caught, he confessed and was sentenced to 461 years in prison without possibility of parole. This monster died in prison on August 21st, 2014. Arizona, Mark Godot. Mark Godot was born on September 6, 1964 in Phoenix, Arizona. Although his time active was only a mere 10 months, the level of terror he was able to bring to the Phoenix metro area was almost unbelievable. Mark Godot, also known as the Baseline Killer, was a serial killer, kidnapper, thief, and assaulter. In this 10-month spree from 2005 to 2006, not only did he commit 9 murders, but has also committed 84 other felony charges. Mark Godot was a seriously bad guy, and in 2006 was sentenced to multiple death sentences, and now he currently awaits execution on death row. According to the available data, he was only active as a serial killer and serial assaultist for the 10 months that it claims, although I find it hard to believe that Mark was simply a great dude before this time frame. One reason I believe this is because one of the felonies that he committed, mind you, one of the total 93, is a crime that involves him robbing and assaulting a 12-year-old girl at gunpoint. Scum. Moving on. Arkansas. Ronald Gene Simmons. No, not Gene Simmons, the guy your dad thinks is really cool, the guy that your dad paints his face like, the guy that your dad gets too drunk listening to and hits you. That's Gene Simmons. This is Ronald Gene Simmons. Back on a serious note, Ronald Gene Simmons was a mass murderer who killed 16 people, including 14 family members. Almost as if he was competing with Mark Godot, who committed 9 murders in 10 months, Ronald Gene Simmons committed 16 murders in only 7 days. In Arkansas during December 1987. Ronald G. Simmons was born on July 15, 1940. Simmons served in the military before moving to Arkansas, and on December 22nd to 28th in 1987, he methodically murdered his family members at his home and then later killed 2 other people and injured 4 more in a nearby town. He was arrested without resistance and was convicted of the murder. Simmons was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection on June 25th, 1990. Gene Simmons from the band Kiss wanted to rock and roll all night and party every day. Ronald Gene Simmons from Arkansas wanted to kill people. California. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, is likely one of the most infamous names on this list. Strangely, I have never covered him on the channel, even though I've made numerous videos about serial killers. Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, but moved to California at the age of 22. Ramirez's crimes were heavily influenced by his troubled childhood, and he even had a cousin who taught him military skills that Ramirez ended up later using during his killing spree. That killing spree and honestly crime spree, which also included assaults and burglaries, took place in the greater Los Angeles area from 1984 to 1985. During this time, he committed numerous heinous crimes such as home invasions, murders, and assaults. His crime spree, marked by extreme violence and satanic rituals, created widespread fear throughout the LA area. And fortunately, he was caught on August 31st, 1985, where he was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and remained on death row until he died of cancer on June 7th, 2013. Colorado. Scott Lee Kimball. Scott Lee Kimball was a former FBI informant who was convicted of murdering at least 4 people between 2003 and 2004 while working with the FBI. Kimball was born on September 21st, 1966 in Boulder, Colorado. Kimball was a skilled forager who ran a legitimate business buying and selling organic beef, but primarily used his business as a vessel to enrich himself by passing on bad checks and other forged documents. This is relevant because Kimball would forge documents of his murder victims to make it appear as if they were still alive after they were already dead. Kimball exploited his informant status to evade suspicion and continued his crimes until inconsistencies caught up to him and he was arrested. Not only did he expose flaws in the FBI's informant program, but he was also sentenced to 70 years in prison, where he currently stays today. Oh, and if you're curious who the victims were, it was his uncle, his stepdaughter, and 2 of the girlfriends of inmates. This is almost exactly what I meant when I said that I don't believe someone who was an active serial killer was just a good person before their killing spree. This is a great example of that. Connecticut. Michael Ross. Michael Bruce Ross was born on July 26, 1959 in Connecticut. Ross was also known as the Roadside Strangler and the Eggman, whatever that means. Between 1981 and 1984, he murdered and assaulted 8 young women in New York and Connecticut. According to people that knew him growing up, he exhibited antisocial behavior from a very young age. He was sentenced to death for his crimes in 1987 and was executed via lethal injection in 2005. A fun fact about Michael Ross is that he was the last person to be executed in Connecticut before they abolished capital punishment in 2012. Delaware. Stephen Pennell. Stephen Brian Pennell, also known as the Route 40 Killer, was born on November 22, 1957. Interestingly, Pennell is Delaware's only known serial killer in modern history. Good job, Delaware. But unfortunately, that doesn't make his situation any better. Pennell was convicted of the murder and assault of 2 women and was suspected of 3 others. As the name suggests, he abducted most of his victims on Route 40. Pennell was sentenced to death and executed via lethal injection in 1992, making him the first person executed in Delaware in over 46 years. Florida. Eileen Wuornos. I've actually covered Eileen on the channel before, and her story is really quite interesting. Not only was she a female serial killer, but she was a female sex worker who targeted her male client. From 1989 to 1990, while she was working as a prostitute along the highways of Florida, Eileen killed and robbed 7 of her male clients. When caught, she claimed that she was simply defending herself from assault, but that story didn't quite work. Wuornos was arrested in 1991 and convicted of 6 murders and was executed via lethal injection in 2002. Fun fact about Eileen is that there's actually a movie made about her story called Monster, which released in 2003. Georgia. Wayne Williams. Williams, also known as the Atlanta Monster, the Atlanta Boogeyman, and the Atlanta Child Killer, was born on May 27, 1958. Wayne was only ever convicted of 2 murders, those being the murders of 2 adult men. But what's peculiar is the fact that he is heavily suspected of being responsible for the murder of 24 children. From 1979 to 1981, there was a spree of child murders in Atlanta known as the Atlanta Child Murders. I find it quite interesting that there's enough evidence to heavily suspect Wayne of being responsible for a very specific number of these murders, but not enough evidence to convict him. I guess it's fortunate that he was at least convicted of these 2 adult murders, but I'm sure his story would be much different if he was convicted of at least some of the child murders he was suspected of committing. Hawaii. Randall Saito. Randall Saito is admittedly not a serial killer, but he is still a killer. Saito randomly and brutally killed a woman at Ala Moana Center in 1979, and since then has been spending time in a mental institution as he was acquitted of this murder due to insanity. That's upsetting and scary. What else is scary is the fact that he escaped the mental hospital in 2017. He walked out of the facility, took a taxi to the airport, and flew to California using a fake name. Fortunately, Saito was caught days later and was charged an additional 5 years for the escape, but his escape definitely raised questions about the security lapses at the hospital. Like, I know Hawaii is laid back and chill, but it boggles my mind that in 2017, not 1987, in 2017, he just walked out, took a taxi, and took a flight with a fake name. Wild. Idaho. Paul Ezra Rhodes. Paul is one of your more or less cookie-cutter serial killers. He went on a killing spree, killed young women, was convicted of some of the murders, was suspected of more, and was executed via lethal injection. Like everyone on this list, this dude was horrible and disgusting. Illinois. John Wayne Gacy. If you're the type of person to be watching this video, then you're probably the type of person who knows who John Wayne Gacy is. He is one of the most infamous American serial killers and is widely known for his assault, torture, and murder of at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy's story is long and well documented, and I will only be giving a brief overview in this video, but if you're interested, there's a lot of documentaries. Gacy famously lived a double life, as he was seen as a pillar of the community by throwing events for the neighborhood. He was a manager at KFC and then started a construction business after spending some time in jail. Gacy was known as the Killer Clown because during his community events, he would typically dress up as a clown to entertain his neighbors. Although, unfortunately, for some of his victims, he would also dress up as the clown and assault and murder them. Gacy's story is extremely disturbing and was ultimately caught when bodies were discovered underneath his floor in his basement. Gacy was arrested on December 21st, 1978. He was then sentenced to death in 1980 and executed via, you guessed it, lethal injection in 1994. If a clown ever asks you if you want to try getting out of handcuffs, don't do it. Indiana. Herb Baumeister. Baumeister is a serial killer from Indiana and was active from the 1980s to the 1990s. He is suspected to have murdered at least 11 men and possibly all the way up to over 25 men. Due to the fact that there was no trial, this is all suspected, which is something we'll get into, but it's pretty certain. Why I say that is because human remains were found on Baumeister's property. Not only were the remains of 11 men found on the property, but there was also over 10,000 bone fragments scattered across the grounds of his farm. It is believed that Baumeister would lure victims into his home, specifically gay men, where he would then assault them and then kill them before burying their bodies. Once the police caught on and began looking for Baumeister, he had already escaped to Canada, where he took his own life in a national park before police could ever catch up to him. And for that reason, he was never convicted and never sentenced. But I think he knew what he had coming. Iowa. Earl Nelson. Earl Nelson is one of the oldest entries on this list so far, being born on May 12th, 1897 in California. Earl Nelson was also known as the Gorilla Man or the Dark Strangler. He was a serial killer, a assaultist, and a necrophile, and was also considered to be the first known serial assault murderer in the 20th century. He committed over 22 murders and also 22 separate attacks all across the west coast of the United States, including primarily Iowa. Nelson targeted landladies and their daughters. It would gain entry to their homes by posing as a prospective tenant. He would then strangle the victims and do extremely unspeakable things. Nelson was caught in Canada, of all places, in 1927 and was executed by hanging, not lethal injection. So there you go, something new. Kansas. Dennis Rader. Okay, so this guy is wild. Everybody on this list is a complete lunatic, but this one in particular, I just finished watching a documentary about him. He was known as the BTK killer, which is actually an acronym for his routine, I guess you could say. He would bind, torture, and then kill his victims. And that's how he referred to himself as well. He was active in Wichita, Kansas from 1974 until 1991, a huge gap. What's even crazier is that he wasn't even caught until 2005 when he was arrested and pled guilty to all of the murders. What's potentially even crazier than his time active as a killer, or the large gap after his active period where he was just still free, is the fact that he would also, during his time active, would taunt the media outlets and police by leaving detailed messages describing his crimes. The only reason he was ever even caught is because in 2004, after a 13-year hiatus, he decided it was a good time to start rewriting letters and begin taunting the police again, when at this point, technology was advanced and they weren't playing around, and they caught him shortly after in the following year, and he was arrested, like I mentioned, in 2005. He's currently serving 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kentucky. Donald Harvey. This monster is a little bit different than some of the other monsters on this list. Harvey was a killer who claimed to have 87 murders, but was only confirmed to have 37. Still a ludicrous amount. He was active in Ohio, Kentucky between 1970 and 1987, a 17-year span. He gave himself the name the Angel of Death, and it'll all make sense in a second. Harvey was a healthcare worker and said that he started killing his patients to simply put them out of their misery, but said he eventually grew to enjoy killing his patients. Harvey would typically kill his victims by poisoning them with cyanide or suffocating them with a pillow. How Harvey was caught after doing this for so long, 17 years, is because the last victim he ever killed was a man who was on life support for several months after a motorcycle accident. His autopsy revealed the large amount of cyanide in his system, and then people began to grow suspicious, specifically of Harvey. They became extremely suspicious of him when they learned that he was forced to resign from a previous job in a Cincinnati hospital when he was caught stealing body parts for an occult ritual. Wild that he was even able to continue working in healthcare at all. Harvey lived in prison from 1987 all the way up until 2017 when he was found in his cell severely beaten and then later succumbed to his injuries and died in prison. It's crazy to me that someone working in healthcare with a very strange and peculiar history is able to kill at least 37 people over 17 years and not get caught for so long. We're not even halfway done this video yet, and we've heard some disgusting and deplorable stories. And I'm sorry to inform you, it doesn't get much better. So I did want to take just a quick breather before we got back into it. Okay, if you currently make YouTube videos, I want you to watch this. And if you don't, just skip to this timestamp. I get a ton of questions about how I make my videos, what I use to animate, what I use to illustrate, how I grew on YouTube, and everything of the sort. And my friend, Internet Anarchist, also had a lot of similar questions as well too. Him and I both had very fortunate experiences growing on YouTube, and it wasn't an accident or luck at all. It's my belief that success is caused by three things, not just on YouTube, but in anything: knowledge, experience, and immersion. Knowledge meaning having the right knowledge to know what to do and where to go. Experience meaning actually putting that knowledge into practice, testing it out, and learning for yourself with the proper guidance to avoid major mistakes. And immersion. Immersion meaning being surrounded by like-minded individuals that are on the same path as you, that you can compare notes with and relate to. A big problem that we've noticed in the YouTube community right now is there is a lot of people trying to sell information to brand new YouTubers who don't have a budget and don't even know any better. So they'll fall for every trick in the book, and it's extremely disheartening. Internet Anarchist and I both realized that there was something that we could do, and we did it. That's why for any of my subscribers who have a YouTube channel that are wanting to actually grow and take YouTube seriously, I would love to invite you to our new school community called 1 of 10 Community. This is a completely free community. It's always free and will forever be free. It currently includes myself, Internet Anarchist, other huge YouTubers, and over 1,400 other small creators that are looking to grow their channel and are working every day to get better and providing each other feedback and support. My goal with this group is to provide small and upcoming YouTubers the absolute best opportunity to be able to grow quickly in a way that's not a scam. Like I said, there's a lot of predators on YouTube, and not that kind of predator, that are looking to prey upon small YouTubers who have the dream of growing but don't have the knowledge of making it happen. And unfortunately, these people are typically easily fooled by fake plaques and fake screenshots, and they are sold expensive courses that don't help them. That's why me and Internet Anarchist made something that was better than these paid courses, and it's absolutely free. So before we get back into the killing spree, if you are a YouTuber that follows me and you want to grow more on YouTube, please, I would love you to join 1 of 10 Community. The link's in the description. It's a completely free school community. Make an account and join a network of a ton of YouTubers like yourself who are just trying to grow and make their dreams come true. Okay, back into the void. Louisiana. Derek Todd Lee. Lee was born on November 5th, 1968, and was from St. Francisville in Louisiana. He is also known as the Baton Rouge serial killer and is known for his killing spree from 1998 all the way up to 2003, where during this time, he terrorized Baton Rouge and surrounding areas by committing at least 7 murders of, you guessed it, women. Before his murders, he was a great guy, right? No, not at all. Before his murder charges, Lee was actually arrested for stalking women and watching them in their own home. In an interesting twist, despite this previous arrest, during the search for this serial killer, the police overlooked him because they assumed the serial killer was white. However, Lee was eventually linked to all of these murders of these women in Louisiana via DNA tests, and in 2004, he was put on trial and was sentenced to death. Lee did not end up being killed via lethal injection because he actually died of heart disease in the hospital while on death row at the ripe old age of 47. Maine. James Hicks. Hicks is the only known serial killer from the state of Maine, and information on him was not easy to find. But the long and short of the story is, in 1977, his wife magically disappeared, which caused suspicion, but not that much suspicion because Hicks was not arrested until 1983 and convicted a year later in 1984. Before this arrest, another woman went missing who was last seen at a bar with Hicks. He was never arrested for this disappearance because there was never enough evidence to connect him to it. But after he was suspected of his wife's disappearance 6 years later, they tied the two together. For both of these disappearances, he was only sentenced to 10 years and only served 6 of them and was released from prison in 1990. Once he was released, he met another woman, started a life with her, moved in with her, and 6 years later, murdered her. He was suspected in her disappearance, but Hicks was never charged with her death either because of a lack of evidence. This guy was slimy. The only reason that Hicks was caught is because he was in Texas holding a gun to a 67-year-old woman's head, forcing her to sign over the title of her car to him and then write a note you would write to your loved ones telling them you won't be around, if you get my drift. He planned to drug and drown the woman to make it look like she did it, but this woman somehow escaped and Hicks was caught for this act, sentenced to 55 years, and during this time confessed to the 3 other murders he committed and actually led the Maine authorities directly to the sites where he buried these bodies. But yeah, Maine's only serial killer was a disgusting guy who got way too lucky for way too long. Maryland. Joe Matheny. Matheny is a hilarious name, specifically for this dude because he looks like he enjoys meth-eny. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and claimed to have killed 13 people, but was only ever convicted of 2 of these murders. Research later confirmed 3 additional victims through matching his confessions to evidence. So he was convicted of 2, confirmed 5, and claims up to 13. He specifically preyed on homeless men and prostitutes, luring them in with the promise of food and drugs, and actually would just give them death. Notably, Matheny dismembered some of his victims and even disposed of their remains at a meat stand where he worked. He was arrested in 1996, convicted of multiple murders, and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And in 2017, he was found dead in his cell. So that's him. Massachusetts. Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo, also known as the Boston Strangler, I think the 3rd or 4th strangler on this list so far, is a serial killer who confessed to the murder of at least 13 women in the Boston area between 1962 and 1964. DeSalvo would gain entry to his victims' homes by posing as a handyman. He, not shockingly, would strangle his victims to death. Very interestingly, DeSalvo was never convicted for any of these murders, but was imprisoned for other crimes. In 1973, in prison, he was actually murdered due to an ongoing debate that had taken place in the prison about his involvement with the Boston Strangler cases. So you could say justice was served, but not in the traditional sense. Michigan. Carl Eugene Watts. Watts was born in 1953 in Texas and might have the highest kill count on this list so far. Not that that's an accomplishment at all. It is just a morbid fact. Watts was nicknamed Coral and was dubbed by media outlets the Sunday morning slasher, who murdered an insane amount of women over an 8-year period. He is also suspected of being the most prolific serial killer in all United States history. At the absolute minimum, Watts is responsible for 14 murders, but at the absolute most, he is responsible for over 100 murders. Keep in mind, this was only through an 8-year period. Wild. All of which of these murders took place within Michigan. Watts would stalk his victims, break into their homes, and then kill them using various methods, such as stabbing or strangulation. Watts was arrested in 1982 and was sentenced to life in prison, where he died of cancer in 2007. Minnesota. Paul Michael Stefani. Stefani, also known as the Weepy Voice Killer, was a serial killer who murdered at least 3, you guessed it, women in Minnesota during the early 1980s. He gained his nickname from his tendency to call emergency services after committing his crimes in a sobbing, high-pitched voice. Stefani was caught in 1982 after 2 years of being active and later confessed to the murders. He was sentenced to 40 years of prison and, like some others on this list, died of cancer in prison. Mississippi. Glenn Edward Rogers. Glenn lived a very transient lifestyle and for that reason killed in many different states and lived in many different states. But for the purpose of this video, we're focusing on Mississippi. Glenn is convicted of 2 murders, suspected of 3 more, and claims over 70 total. Glenn was active from 1993 to 1995. And during that time, he worked as a handyman and also, you guessed it, killed women. You can probably guess how as well. Something interesting about this guy though is the fact that he actually was on the FBI top 10 most wanted fugitives list and was caught after a nationwide manhunt. Currently, he's on death row in Florida. Missouri. Robert Burdella. Burdella was a serial killer from Kansas City who was known as the Kansas City Butcher, or more ominously, the Collector. He was active during the 1980s, and during this time, he killed at least 6 young men. Yeah, different. He would lure his victims, who were often young men, into his home where he would subject them to prolonged periods of captivity and torture, typically including assault, and always ended in murder. After being active for 3 years, Burdella was caught in 1988 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He ended up dying in jail 4 years later in 1992 at the age of 43. Montana. Nathaniel Bar Jonah. This case specifically is quite upsetting and disturbing. Jonah was primarily a child assaulter and was only a suspected serial killer and cannibal. And although he has 0 confirmed murders, he has 5 suspected murders and 10 plus confirmed victims that are children that survived. He was active from 1964 all the way until 1999, which is just heartbreaking. At least in 1999, he was apprehended and convicted with assault, kidnapping, attempted murder, and child assaultation, and was given 130 years in prison at the Montana State Prison, where he died in 2008. Gross. Nebraska. Charles Starkweather. This case has one of the fastest timelines on this list. Starkweather was a serial killer who, along with his girlfriend, killed 11 people in the span of only 2 months. The rampage began with the murder of a gas station attendant, and this snowballed into a series of robberies and killings, including the murder of some of his girlfriend's family members. After this 2-month killing spree, the pair was caught in Wyoming after a high-speed chase. Starkweather was sentenced to death and was executed a year later after being caught in 1959. So let me break it down for you. This guy was 18 years old, decides to go on a 2-month killing spree, and is executed via the electric chair only 6 months after being put on death row. He died at the age of 20. That is quick justice. His girlfriend, on the other hand, who was his accomplice, was only sentenced to 17 years in jail. Wild. Nevada. Carol Cole. This is the first man I've ever seen named Carol, so that's something. Cole was a serial killer who was convicted of strangling 2 women in Nevada and murdering 3 others in Texas. This is pretty typical. What's not as typical is that he is believed to be linked to at least 30 other murders between 1947 and 1980. A huge 33-year gap of being an active potential killer. Wild. Cole was sentenced to death for his crimes, and for his last meal, he had jumbo fried shrimp, french fries, and salad with French dressing, and Boston clam chowder. And the next day, he was executed via lethal injection on December 6th, 1985. New Hampshire. Sheila LaBear. In 2008, Sheila was convicted for murdering 2 of her boyfriends in 2005 and 2006, respectively. And she claims that she did this because she was sent by God as an avenging angel to Earth to punish pedophiles, which in her mind included her 2 boyfriends, whose bodies were found on her huge farm. Now you might be like, all right, I can get behind this a bit, I get it. Here's another twist. According to Brad Bailey, a defense attorney who represented her, he says, and I quote, "There seemed to be no basis whatsoever in reality to suggest or claim any of her victims were pedophiles or engaged in any of these child abusing behaviors. None whatsoever." So yeah, not only did she murder people, but she also tried to ruin their name. Sheila typically met her victims by putting out personal ads looking for farmhands on her farm. Although she was only convicted of the murder of 2 men, she also admitted during her trial that she killed several others, but these were not confirmed. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. New Jersey, Richard Biegenwald. Biegenwald was active from 1958 all the way till 1983. And during this time, you guessed it, he murdered people. In 1983, he was convicted of 5 murders, but was suspected of 8. An interesting fact is, after the serial killer died, his lawyer actually mentioned publicly that this criminal told his lawyer that he may have up to 100 victims, which is likely inflated, but the fact is this monster likely had many more victims than he was convicted for, which doesn't seem extremely uncommon for this list. Richard was actually on death row for a short amount of time, but it was overturned and he was resentenced to life in prison, where he still died in prison in 2008. New Mexico, David Parker Ray. Ray was a suspected torturer who is also known as the Toy Box Killer. This case is really interesting because he technically has 0 murders confirmed, but has 3 confirmed victims and possibly anywhere from 60 to 100 plus victims that he tortured and assaulted on his property in his toy box, which was basically a trailer beside his home, which is a movable, portable torture chamber that he had a large kidnapping and assault operation happening in there. Crazy. For the unthinkable amount of torture that he inflicted upon potentially hundreds of women, Ray was sentenced to 224 years in prison, where he unfortunately only served a few months because he died of a heart attack. Unfortunate he didn't serve more time, not unfortunate that he died. Ray was a serious monster and is even quoted saying that he did nothing wrong to women. He only did what women wanted and he got pleasure from their pleasure. And his assault on these women was, in his mind, him doing good for society. So he thought it'd be total sicko. New York, David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam or Mr. Monster, according to Wikipedia, was a serial killer who terrorized New York City in the summer of 1976 and 1977. Berkowitz, surprise, surprise, targeted young women and couples, shooting them in cold blood with a .44 caliber revolver. His crimes sparked a citywide manhunt for him, and he even left notes taunting the police, promising more crimes. Fortunately, Berkowitz was caught in 1977 and later confessed to all of his crimes, which were plentiful. He ended up murdering 6 people and wounding 11 more. He is currently in jail serving 6 life sentences as we speak. North Carolina, Henry Louis Wallace. Wallace may have one of the most odd nicknames on this list. He is known as the Charlotte Strangler, which is somewhat tame, but he's also known as the Taco Bell Strangler. This video is not a laughing matter, but that name is weird. I guess it's because he worked as a manager at Taco Bell in Charlotte. Wallace was a serial assaulter and murderer, targeting young African-American women, and over the course of a 4-year span, he victimized over 9 women. He was caught in March of 1994 and currently sits on death row awaiting execution. North Dakota, Eugene Butler. The story of Butler is unlike anything we've heard on this list so far. He is the only killer who was never convicted of his crimes so far on this list. Eugene Butler was born in 1849 in New York State, but all of his crimes took place and he actually died in North Dakota. But we'll get into that. From the years of 1900 to 1906 in Niagara, North Dakota, Butler murdered 6 teenage boys in his house and buried the bodies in his basement. Now, the twist of all this, Butler was actually committed to an insane asylum for unrelated charges where he died in 1913. The crazy part is the bodies that were buried in his house were not found until 1915, 2 years after Butler died in the insane asylum. Super weird. Ohio, Anthony Sowell. The story of Sowell is something we've heard numerous times on this list so far, so I'll keep it brief. He had a generic name. He was known as the Cleveland Strangler. He was active for 2 years, from 2007 till 2009. He murdered at least 11 women who he targeted, specifically women that were vulnerable. By that I mean women that were either dealing with addiction or homeless. And he was arrested in 2009 when one of his victims escaped and alerted authorities. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and was sentenced to death in 2011. Sowell died in 2021 due to an unspecified terminal illness. Oklahoma. Roger Dale Stafford. Stafford was a serial killer active from 1974 until 1978, and in this time he had 9 confirmed kills, which he was evicted of, but potentially a lot more. Stafford started his killing spree by killing an assistant manager working at a McDonald's. After killing this manager, he robbed the McDonald's for over $1,300 and then continued on his spree. His next targets were a family that he flagged off the side of the highway, who he robbed and murdered the entire family. 3 weeks later, he robbed a sirloin stockade in Oklahoma City, and during this robbery murdered 6 employees, most of these victims being teenage staff members. 6 days after this restaurant massacre, Stafford was found and apprehended. Unsurprisingly, he was sentenced to death, and in 1995, he was executed via lethal injection. Oregon. Dayton Leroy Rogers. Dubbed the Molalla Forest Murderer due to the fact that he would dump the bodies of his victims in the Molalla Forest in Oregon. Rogers was a serial killer who was active for, once again, 4 years and targeted, once again, vulnerable women, specifically addicts, sex workers, and the like. Rogers notably was sentenced to death 4 times, with each sentence being overturned by the Oregon Supreme Court. And in 2021, his death sentence was overturned again due to new laws, and in 2022, his sentence was commuted to life without parole. Pennsylvania. Gary Heidnik. Gary was a serial kidnapper, torturer, and murderer, and fortunately was only active for just over a year. During this year, he kidnapped 6 women, 2 of which died from his torture, and the other 4 fortunately survived. One of these surviving victims was actually able to go to the authorities and inform them about Gary's horrendous actions. Gary was quickly arrested in March 1987 and convicted of multiple charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, assault, aggravated assault, and more. He was sentenced to death, and in 1999, he was executed via lethal injection and was one of the last people to ever be executed in the state of Pennsylvania. Rhode Island. Craig Price. I believe Price is the youngest killer we've seen on this list, with his first murders taking place when he was only 13 years old. From the ages of 13 to 15, he committed 4 murders of women in his neighborhood, and he was arrested at the age of 15. Due to his age, he was actually initially set for release at the age of 21, which to me is mind-boggling for someone who murdered 4 people, no matter their age. But due to ongoing violent behavior within prison, he was sentenced to a much longer time and actually tried as an adult. He will likely never see the light of day. South Carolina. Donald Henry Gaskins. Gaskins was born in 1933 and unfortunately had a huge span of crimes in his lifetime, starting in 1953 and going all the way until 1982. During this time, he had 15 confirmed kills and later on claimed he had up to 110. He killed hitchhikers, acquaintances, and more, and had a laundry list of charges under his belt. A couple notable things about Gaskins is the fact that when he was arrested, he was actually sentenced to death, but then was later commuted to only life in prison, but then later killed someone in prison using a bomb, and because of that was once again sentenced to death and later executed in prison in 1991. Dude literally got off death row and got right back on with a bomb somehow. Crazy. South Dakota. Robert Leroy Anderson. Anderson was your run-of-the-mill creep. He was an assaulter and killer. He has at least 2 confirmed victims across multiple states in the US, primarily South Dakota, and would typically lure victims by posing as a photographer wanting to take pictures of people. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1984, and in 2002 died in prison while waiting for execution. Tennessee. Paul Dennis Reed. Reed was also known as the fast food killer, specifically because he targeted fast food workers working the late shift. He would rob, assault, and murder these employees, and was sentenced to death for the murder of 7 fast food employees in the Nashville metropolitan area. Reed was sentenced to death and died in 2013 while waiting for execution. Fast food employees really deal with too much. Texas. Dean Corll. Corll, also known as the Candyman or the Pied Piper, was a mass serial killer, serial assaulter, and serial torturer, and was a member of the Houston mass murders, which at the time of its discovery were considered the worst example of serial murders in the entire history of the US. Corll was known as the Candyman because his family had previously owned and operated a candy company in Houston, and he personally had been known to give free candy to local children, which is the most stereotypical and scary thing I've ever heard. and he was known as the Pied Piper because his murders would typically start with him luring people, typically with the offer of a ride or for an invite to a party. From the years of 1970 to 1973, Corll and his 2 accomplices murdered at the very least 28 victims. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how much time Corll got because he was never sentenced. He was actually murdered by one of his accomplices before he was ever caught, which may be good or bad news depending on how you look at it. After this accomplice killed Corll, they called the police and promptly confessed to all of the murders, leading to the discovery that shocked Houston to its core: Utah. Ted Bundy. If you're watching this video, you definitely know who Ted Bundy is, and I probably don't need to tell his story. But as a quick recap, he has an unknown amount of victims, but it's likely believed to be in the range of 30 to 36. He was active during the 1970s and was executed in 1989. If you want more details, watch this video. I go in extreme depth about his story. He is a great example of why you should never judge a book by its cover. Vermont. Israel Keyes. Keyes is a very strange serial killer. He was extremely meticulous in his planning, but extremely random in his selection of victims. He murdered at least 11 people across multiple states, including Vermont, between 2001 and 2012. And Keyes even had a specific method of burying what he called kill kits in different locations so he could commit murder at any time. He was captured in 2012 and didn't continue living, I'm not going to say unalive because that's the dumbest thing ever, while awaiting trial, leaving so many questions unanswered about his motives and the true extent of his crimes. Virginia. Timothy Wilson Spencer. Spencer was active from 1994 to 1998, once again, 4 years, committed 5 assaults and murders, and was sentenced to death by electric chair, not lethal injection. Washington. Gary Ridgway. Ridgway was active from 1982 to 1988, confirmed, and was possibly active as recent as 2001. He was arrested on November 30th in 2001 and confessed to murdering at least 71 women, many of whom were vulnerable women, like we explained before. This unfathomable kill count made him one of the most prolific serial killers in US history. In 2001, he pled guilty to 48 counts of murder to avoid the death penalty and is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It's crazy how someone with 71 murders can actually avoid the death sentence. Whether you're for it or against it, it's crazy how somebody with 2 murders can get the death penalty, but someone with 48 confirmed at the very least can get around it. West Virginia. Harry Powers. Powers was an active killer in the 1930s and was particularly evil because he preyed upon vulnerable, lonely widows who had just lost a loved one. He would meet them on classified ads in the newspaper and would murder them for their money. During his time active, he killed at least 5 women and 3 children before being caught. He was tried, convicted, and executed in 1932. Once his story gained national attention, it was considered to be a contributing factor to people's fear of meeting people through classified ads in the newspaper. Wisconsin. Jeffrey Dahmer. Much like Ted Bundy, this demented monster likely needs no introduction. His story has been told many times, and his infamy is widespread. If you want an in-depth review, here's a video where I discuss his story at length. In short, he murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He primarily targeted black young men, luring them into his home with the promises of sex or money. He did unspeakable things to his victims' bodies and was arrested in 1991 and sentenced to 16 life terms in prison, but was only killed a few years later in 1994 by a fellow inmate. Wyoming. Dale Wayne Eaton. Eaton was a suspect in a string of murders known as the Great Basin Murders, which took place from 1983 to 1997, where over 9 victims, most of them being teenage females, were assaulted and killed. Eaton was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to life in prison. And ladies and gentlemen, there we have it. One serial killer from every single state. There was honestly a surprising amount of similarities across the board. Notably, at least to me, were the fact that a lot of these murderers were able to get away for 4 years. That was a pretty common trend. And every killer has some weird nickname, like the something strangler, which is the most common. It's like being a rapper and having Lil in your name. And a very unfortunate and upsetting trend is that almost every serial killer was also a serial assaultist, except for one guy. One guy, or maybe 2 of these guys, was a robber that murdered people. Not necessarily much better. Animals with the most depressing lives. Now look, you might be thinking you have it pretty bad, and you might even be watching this video to try to make yourself feel better. And if that's the case, then just remember, if you're alive, you have an internet connection, and you have a device to watch this video on, you have something to be grateful for. But also, if you're not one of these animals on this list, then you definitely have something to be grateful for. Because in my opinion, the animals on this list have some of the most depressing existences of all time. Oh yeah, and like always, this list gets more and more depressing as the video goes on. Starting off, we have hamsters. And I know this might sound strange, but hear me out. First and foremost, most people see hamsters as a toy instead of a pet. And that for an animal is a horrible existence. Imagine you're just a cute fuzzball and then you have like some 6-year-old kid who always throws you in a ball and throws you down the stairs. A lot of people see hamsters as a low-maintenance pet, which is ideal for a great first pet for a child. But the problem is a lot of these children can't even use a spoon properly, and we expect them to take care of a living creature? That's ridiculous. Besides the fact that in a best-case scenario, these animals are kept in a small cage their entire life, and some of the most exposure they have to the outside world is in a ball that typically gets kicked down the stairs or worse. That alone isn't ideal, but for me, that's the beginning of it, not the end of it. I don't know about for you guys, but for me, I feel like everybody I knew growing up had a crazy hamster story that all involved their pet hamster dying in some sort of tragic way. Let me tell you mine. I remember being, I don't know, maybe grade 7 when I remember talking to one of my friends. She was talking about her pet hamster. It's funny because I never saw her with a pet hamster, so I asked her what happened to it, and she told me this story. Supposedly, she was hanging out in the backyard with her family at a small family event when her uncle was building a house out of bricks for the hamster that she was playing with in the backyard. She put the hamster in the house of bricks and it collapsed and squished her hamster. And that was just her story. And I feel like that is not a rare instance. Everyone gets hamsters for literally 20 bucks at PetSmart and they think they have a living bouncy ball or something. It's ridiculous. But even if a hamster has the perfect owners and it has a great enclosure and everything is great, their existence is still quite rough. Specifically the fact that they eat their own babies relatively often. If you happen to be a hamster baby, unfortunately, you can't trust your mom because if she gets overly stressed out or if you're stressing her out, there is a very likely chance that she will eat you. Hamsters will eat their children for one of two reasons. One, they are overly stressed out and they simply believe that the place that they are in is not suitable to have children, so they will eat the babies to protect them from having a bad life, I suppose. Or if they are simply too stressed out, they will eat their baby as a trauma response, I guess. I can only assume that this is not fun for the hamster mom, and I can definitely assume it is not fun for the hamster baby. But if you're getting so stressed out on the regular that you're eating your own children, you can't be living the best life. Hamsters are just cute little guys that honestly deserve better. But let's keep moving. Next up, we have the mantis. And for just a bit of a heads up, this segment is gonna get PG-13. Oh yeah, we're getting crazy. The mantis, or more commonly known as the praying mantis, is a pretty cool green bug that eats other bugs and is overall pretty dope. And honestly, I don't believe they live a super horrible life, but there is one aspect of their life that I think trivializes everything, at least if you're a man. And you might already know where I'm going. Mantises may have some of the worst mating rituals I have ever heard of, which I am now going to explain. Cue the cheesy music. So when a mommy mantis and a daddy mantis love each other very much, they will express their love in a very meaningful way. But something happens typically at the end of this ceremony that is very, very notable. It doesn't happen every time, but very commonly, the mommy mantis will rip the head off the daddy mantis and eat it. And they do this for two very important reasons. The first reason they do this is so the mother can make sure that they have the nutrients required to hold and carry these babies to ensure that they are strong and make it into adulthood and exist. The second reason they do this is to ensure that the male keeps his antenna in her for as long as possible to give the mother mantis as much of a chance as possible to guarantee her pregnancy, I suppose. As a dude, this sounds completely and utterly horrible. And as a man mantis, you have one of two choices. You got to make the decision to either never engage with women ever, or engage with a woman but understand the fact that it will likely be the last thing you ever do. For me, that fact alone was reason enough to put them on this list. Following that, we have a case that is definitely more upsetting and depressing, and that is the polar bear. Think about it. The last 3 polar bears you've seen has probably been within the context of showing how their habitat is slowly eroding, typically accompanied with a picture of a polar bear that is way skinnier than you ever thought a polar bear could be. Polar bears used to have it made. They were drinking Coca-Cola with Santa Claus and whatnot, but now, sadly, that's no longer the case. I don't know what happened when I said Coca-Cola, but I'm just gonna leave that in. Coca-Cola, it is truly upsetting that the ecosystems that polar bears once thrived in are slowly diminishing, and this is greatly impacting their livelihood. And unfortunately, this means for the most part that polar bears have turned to cannibalism to survive. And unfortunately, this is extremely bad news for cubs and mother polar bears, as male polar bears are now eating female and cub polar bears to survive, now turning the hunters into the hunted. Having your home be destroyed and then having your dad eat your entire family, in my opinion, is extremely depressing. And one thing I will note is that this isn't like the norm. Like if 2 polar bears see each other, they don't just instantly eat each other. But unfortunately, the situation for some polar bears has gotten so bad that it has driven them to this circumstance. Upsetting, but let's move on. Okay, so this one isn't that crazy, and I honestly wanted to put it before the polar bear, but I didn't want to have like 2 insects in a row. This is an animal video, not like a bug convention. And this is also an entry that I'm sure is going to get no sympathy, but I still wanted to mention it. This entry being the mosquito. They do have a really short lifespan, with men living typically less than a week and women living up to 2 weeks, but that's not really the most depressing part of their existence. In my opinion, the most depressing part about being a mosquito is the fact that literally everybody in the world hates you. Nobody likes you. Nobody wants you. Nobody wants anything to do with you. Nobody's happy about your existence, and there is literally nothing you can do to be better because you just have a week to kind of live and do some weird stuff, and you suck. Both literally and figuratively. But yeah, I don't know. Mosquitoes suck, and I think that being a mosquito would suck because literally nobody likes you. I can only imagine how that feels, having the entire world hate you and a lot of people wishing you never existed. But I feel like if nothing else, it's definitely got to make for a pretty depressing existence. And if you ever end up feeling like a mosquito, just remember, hey, I'm not a mosquito. I'm a person. I live for more than a week, and I can do whatever I want. And there is people that love me. I'm pretty awesome. And life is pretty awesome. Just not if you're a mosquito. But that's all I got on them. Let's move on. Next up, we have the anglerfish, which if you're unfamiliar, they look like this. Okay, first of all, just imagine being this ugly. Yeah, sure, they had a cool cameo in Finding Nemo, but like, that's about it. Second of all, living at the bottom of the ocean has gotta suck. Oh yeah, they live at the bottom of the ocean. It's cold, it's dark, and sure, you have this kind of cool little light coming off your head, but it's also kind of sus. Like, bro, what's this big long thing dangling in your face all the time? But besides living in almost complete darkness, besides their bulb thing, and living in extremely cold water with high pressure, or being extremely ugly, once again, they have an extremely absurd mating ritual, which I will get into. So anglerfish use a type of mating that can only be described as an extreme version of sexual dimorphism and parasitism. Already off to a great start. Tiny male anglerfish latch onto much larger females by biting into them, eventually fusing their bodies and circulatory systems. The males lose most of their organs and become dependent on the females for nutrients while providing them with sperm in return. This adaptation ensures reproduction in the sparse deep sea environment where sexual encounters are rare. I don't know why, but I find this one kind of funny, especially in today's modern like dating ecosystem where everything is so value-based. Like, what do you bring to the table? What do you bring for the table? And then the male anglerfish is just like, you're gonna have to feed me. I'm gonna be living off your blood, basically. I'm gonna be half dead, but I can give you sperm in return. And I don't know why, but sperm in return sounds hilarious. But yeah, that's the reality for the anglerfish. Cold, dark, squishy, ugly, and as soon as you meet a woman, you have to instantly start living off of her and provide her with sperm for life. I'll let you guys decide. Depressing or awesome? Now, next up on our list and our final entry is more or less of a honorable mention, or at least a general group and not one specific animal. That being the extremely sad and unfortunate existence of any animal in a factory farm or a testing facility. Now, before you click off, I'm not getting on my vegan soapbox and talking about what you should do. That's not my point at all. But I think it's important we acknowledge the reality of what's going on and the fact that a lot of animals have it very poorly in systems that we are all involved in. Without getting into too much detail, there are so many smart, cute, adorable, and living creatures that are simply put in horrible conditions for, in many cases, almost meaningless reasons. There is facilities that have beagles smoking cigarettes all day. And there is also machines that grind up baby chicks 24/7. And even if you think a smoking beagle sounds pretty cool or you love ground chicken, you have to admit the reality of life for animals in testing facilities or factory farms is beyond horrible. And for me personally, I wanted to mention it because I love animals, and no matter what your opinion is or what you choose to do, I think it's important that we at least acknowledge this.